More than 200 years ago, in the early 1800s, long before weather forecasts or emergency shelters existed, you find yourself drifting into a world where winter is not something you check on a calendar, but something that arrives like a silent decision made by the sky itself. Snow is already in the air even before you fully understand where you are standing. The horizon stretches endlessly, broken only by dark tree lines and the faint smoke of distant cabins. Everything feels both vast and strangely intimate, as if the land is watching you breathe. You are there now, in the American frontier winter, where every sound seems softer, and even your footsteps feel borrowed from the snow. The wind moves low and steady, brushing past your face like a cold memory you cannot quite place. Somewhere far off, a door creaks wood settling under frost, and it feels louder than it should in the silence. If you are listening from somewhere warm right now, maybe a city apartment or a quiet room at night, you might pause for a moment and imagine this contrast. Tell me where you are watching from, maybe the United States, the United Kingdom, Tokyo, or somewhere else entirely, and what time it is for you while this cold old world unfolds in your mind. In this frontier setting, records confirm that settlers often faced temperature drops so sudden that rivers could freeze within days, trapping entire communities before they even realized winter had fully arrived. Oddly enough, some diaries mention that the first snowfall was sometimes welcomed with relief because it meant the mud roads would finally harden enough for wagons to move more easily. Yet historians still argue whether early settlers truly understood the long-term danger of these rapid freezes, or whether they simply adapted out of necessity without fully grasping the pattern. You begin walking forward, though you are not sure if it is morning or late afternoon. The sky is pale, almost silver, and every breath feels slightly heavier than it should. The scent of burning wood lingers faintly in the air, mixing with the sharp smell of cold pine. Under your boots, snow compresses with a soft crunch that feels oddly rhythmic, almost like the land is responding to your presence. A small frontier settlement slowly emerges ahead. Log cabins sit close together as if trying to share warmth through proximity alone. Smoke rises from chimneys in thin threads that disappear quickly into the cold sky. There is no central authority visible here, no modern system of weather alerts or coordinated emergency response. Just people, wood fire, and endurance. You notice how the cabins are built low and heavy, their roofs angled sharply to prevent snow from accumulating. The walls are thick but imperfect, patched with whatever materials could be found. In one corner a horse shifts restlessly, its breath visible in the air like drifting ghosts. One curious footnote from frontier journals mentions that some settlers believed loud sounds such as shouting or banging metal could temporarily scare away incoming blizzards. There is no scientific basis for this, of course, but the belief persisted in isolated regions for years, especially among families who had survived more than one deadly storm. Inside these early settlements, warmth is never permanent. It is something negotiated hour by hour. Firewood is stacked with careful attention, almost like currency. Every log has value, every spark matters. You can feel how fragile comfort is here, how easily it can vanish if the fire goes out. You step closer to one of the cabins, noticing how the doorframe is slightly warped from repeated freezing and thawing cycles. A faint draft slips through even the smallest gaps. Inside, You imagine families gathered close, sharing heat, listening to the wind as if it were a distant visitor with unknown intentions. Scholars bicker over whether frontier settlers experienced more psychological stress from the cold itself or from the uncertainty of not knowing how long the cold would last. Some argue that it was not the temperature that broke people down, but the endless waiting, the sense that winter might never fully end. A soft sound pulls your attention away again, perhaps the distant crack of ice shifting in a nearby stream. You realize how sensitive your senses become in this environment. Every noise feels amplified by silence. Every movement feels deliberate, as if the world itself is encouraging you to slow down. And yet, even in this early moment, survival is already unfolding around you. Someone is carrying water from a partially frozen barrel. Another person is tightening leather straps on a sled. A child watches snowflakes land on a wooden railing, fascinated by how quickly they disappear. You feel it now, this delicate balance between wonder and danger. The frontier winter does not announce itself with drama. It arrives quietly and then stays. You keep moving forward through this frozen memory of the American frontier, and now the landscape begins to widen, stretching out as if the land itself refuses to offer comfort or boundaries. The cabins you saw before are no longer clustered together. They become rare now, scattered like uncertain thoughts across an endless white expanse. Between them lies distance that feels far greater than it should, especially when every step is measured against cold that never truly loosens its grip. You are following the path of migration westward, though it does not feel like a path at all. It feels more like an ongoing negotiation with survival. Wagon tracks cut through snow in faint lines already half erased by drifting wind. Horses move slowly, their bodies tense under layers of frost forming along their coats. The people traveling with them speak less as the journey deepens, as if words themselves begin to lose warmth. Records confirm that many frontier families underestimated how quickly winter conditions could intensify once they crossed into higher plains and northern territories. What began as manageable cold near settlements often transformed into long, punishing freezes within days of travel. Oddly enough, some migration logs mention that settlers believed the open land would offer cleaner air and easier winters, a hopeful assumption that rarely matched reality. Historians still argue whether this optimism was driven by misinformation or simply the human need to believe hardship would lessen once a new horizon was reached. You feel the wind shift again. It presses against your face, not violently, but persistently, as if it has been walking beside you the entire time. The sound of it moving through dry grass beneath the snow creates a faint whispering texture, like something trying to communicate in a language you almost understand. As you continue, you notice how travel itself becomes a kind of rhythm. Stop, pack, move, rest, repeat. Every action is simplified, stripped of anything unnecessary. Even time begins to blur because there are no clear markers of morning or evening when the sky remains a pale, unbroken gray. One curious footnote from settler diaries describes how families sometimes measured progress not in miles, but in the number of frozen nights endured without breaking formation or losing livestock. It is a strange metric, but in this environment, survival becomes its own form of geography. You pass a small group of wagons pulled slightly off the main direction of travel. Canvas coverings are stiff with frost, and smoke rises weakly from a makeshift fire shielded by wood planks. Someone is stirring a pot that barely steams before the cold steals its heat. A child sits nearby, wrapped in layers that make them appear almost immobile, watching snow gather on their sleeves with quiet fascination. The frontier winter has a way of shrinking human expression. Movements become smaller, conversations become shorter. Even laughter, when it appears, feels cautious, as if it might attract the attention of something harsh and unseen. Scholars bicker over whether this psychological compression was a necessary adaptation or an early form of collective trauma response. Some argue that settlers developed emotional restraint as a survival tool, while others suggest that prolonged exposure to isolation and cold naturally reshaped social behavior over time. You continue walking, and now the terrain shifts slightly. Gentle slopes appear beneath the snow, and the wind no longer travels in straight lines. It curls, bends, and circles around you, creating brief moments where silence feels almost complete. In those moments, you become acutely aware of your own breathing, each exhale briefly visible before dissolving into the air. There is a sound ahead now, faint but distinct, the creak of wooden wheels under strain. A wagon is moving slowly, cutting through deeper snow. The horses pulling it are nearly silent, conserving energy. The driver leans forward, posture tight, eyes scanning ahead, not for beauty, but for obstacles hidden beneath the white surface. Records from frontier travel accounts note that entire migration groups often had to alter their routes based on subtle snow patterns, reading terrain like a map that changed every hour. A slightly darker patch of snow could indicate ice beneath. A smoother surface might conceal deep drifts capable of swallowing a wheel whole. You realize now how much of this world depends on interpretation. Nothing is straightforward. Even safety is temporary, conditional, always waiting for the next shift in weather. A distant memory surfaces from settler writings, describing how some travelers believed the frontier itself tested those who entered it, as if endurance was a requirement rather than a choice. Whether this belief was spiritual, practical, or purely emotional is something historians still argue about, especially when examining how communities justified continuing through repeated storms. The sky darkens slightly, though not dramatically. It is more of a gradual dimming, like a slow blink. Snow begins to fall again, lighter this time, but persistent enough to soften all edges of the world. The wagons ahead become less defined. Trees lose their individual branches and turn into shapes rather than objects. You feel how migration is not just movement across land, but movement through uncertainty. Every decision is made with incomplete information. Every direction carries risk, and yet people continue forward because turning back is equally impossible. Somewhere in the distance, a bell sound might have been used in small settlements to signal arrival of traveling groups, though even this detail varies across accounts. There is no single unified record of frontier life, only fragments, each shaped by memory, hardship, and interpretation. And still you walk. The snow thickens slightly under your feet. The wind lowers its tone. The frontier stretches endlessly ahead, waiting without urgency, as if it has all the time in the world. You are no longer thinking about distance in miles or hours now. Out here on the frontier, time begins to lose its usual meaning, and instead you start noticing smaller, quieter signals that the land offers before everything changes. The air feels slightly different today, not warmer, but more unsettled, as if something unseen is rearranging itself behind the horizon. You walk through a thinning line of trees, their branches stripped bare by repeated cold fronts. The snow beneath your feet is still firm, but it has a different texture now, less predictable. Every few steps your boots sink just a little deeper, as though the ground is testing your weight. Above you, the sky is pale but uneven, streaked with thin layers of cloud that stretch like torn fabric. Records confirm that experienced frontier settlers often relied on environmental cues long before any formal weather prediction systems existed. They watched the behavior of birds, the direction of wind shifts, and even the stillness of forest sounds to anticipate incoming storms. Oddly enough, some journals mention that sudden silence in bird calls was considered a more reliable warning than visible cloud formations. Historians still argue whether these observations were based on consistent patterns or whether survival bias caused people to remember the times these signs were correct while forgetting the times they were not. You begin to notice those signs yourself now. The forest is quieter than it should be, not empty, but restrained, as if every sound is being held back. Even the wind seems to hesitate between movements. There is a faint pressure change in the air, subtle but noticeable if you stay still long enough to feel it settle around your skin. You pause for a moment, and in that pause, the world becomes more detailed. You can hear the soft compression of snow shifting under distant weight, perhaps an animal moving out of sight. You can hear the faint creak of branches adjusting to cold stress. And beneath it all, there is something else, a deeper quiet that does not belong to nature alone, but to anticipation. One curious footnote from frontier accounts describes settlers believing that if smoke from chimneys began to descend, instead of rise, it was a sign that a severe storm was approaching. While this is partially rooted in real atmospheric pressure behavior, the belief often became exaggerated into superstition, with some families refusing to travel for days after observing it. You move forward again, and the trees begin to thin further. The land opens slightly, revealing a wide stretch of frozen plain. The snow here is smoother, almost polished by wind that has passed over it countless times. It reflects light in a way that makes distance difficult to judge. What looks near might still be far, and what looks stable might collapse without warning. A faint trail appears again, possibly from earlier travelers. It is already fading, softened by drifting snow. You realize how fragile navigation is in this environment. Without clear landmarks, direction becomes a memory you must constantly reconstruct. Scholars bicker over whether frontier settlers developed this heightened environmental awareness through necessity alone, or whether certain communities already carried inherited knowledge from colder regions in Europe before migration. There is no final agreement on how much of this skill was learned and how much was remembered. The wind begins to change again. It does not increase in strength, but in presence. It moves closer to the ground, sweeping low across the snow in slow waves. You feel it brushing against your legs, then your coat, then your face, as if it is gradually surrounding you rather than simply passing through. Ahead, a small cluster of structures becomes visible, not a full settlement, but something temporary, perhaps a resting point for travelers. Canvas coverings are stretched between wooden frames, and smoke rises in uneven pulses from a central fire pit. The shapes are indistinct, at first blurred by distance and shifting air. As you approach, you notice movement. People are adjusting ropes, tightening coverings, checking supplies. Everything is done quickly, efficiently, without unnecessary motion. In this environment, hesitation is expensive. Records confirm that such temporary camps were often established along migration routes to serve as emergency shelters during sudden weather shifts. These camps were rarely permanent, yet they became essential lifelines during long winters. Oddly enough, some travelers describe them as both comforting and unsettling because they represented both safety and the reminder that danger was never far behind. Historians still argue whether these camps reduced mortality significantly or merely delayed exposure to harsher conditions further along the journey. You stand near the edge of the camp now. The fire at its center crackles softly, offering a small pocket of warmth that feels almost fragile compared to the surrounding cold. People sit close together, shoulders hunched, conserving heat. Conversations are low, fragmented, more practical than emotional. A child nearby watches steam rise from a cup, fascinated by how quickly it disappears into the air. An older man tightens a leather strap on a sled, checking it twice, then a third time, as if repetition itself provides security. One curious footnote in travel logs mentions that some settlers believed certain songs could calm approaching storms if sung consistently enough. While there is no scientific basis for this, it reveals how deeply people tried to find patterns or influence over an environment that offered very little control. You feel the atmosphere shift again, not dramatically, but enough that those experienced here begin to notice. A few heads turn toward the sky. Someone pauses mid-movement. The fire seems to flicker differently, though it is only wind adjusting its direction. You look upward. The clouds have thickened slightly, forming layers that were not there earlier. The light is dimming in a slow, almost respectful way, as if the day is yielding space to something heavier. Scholars bicker over whether early settlers interpreted these subtle changes accurately, or whether fear amplified their perception of incoming storms. Some argue that experience sharpened their senses, while others suggest that repeated trauma made them more likely to anticipate danger even when it was not fully present. Still, you cannot ignore the feeling. The land is shifting again, and in the frontier winter, that is enough to change everything. The shift in the air does not need to be announced. You feel it before you fully understand it, the kind of change that settles into your bones rather than your thoughts. Around you, the frontier settlement is no longer simply living with winter. It is actively preparing to endure it, as if endurance itself is a daily occupation. You step closer to the cluster of log cabins you saw earlier, and now you notice details that were invisible at a distance. Each structure is built with a kind of practical desperation. Logs stacked tightly and unevenly, gaps filled with mud moss and whatever natural insulation could be gathered before the ground froze too deeply. The roofs are steep, almost exaggerated in angle, designed so snow will slide off instead of collecting into crushing weight. Records confirm that frontier builders often learned through repeated structural failure. Cabins that collapsed under heavy snow one year would be rebuilt differently the next, gradually forming a shared but informal engineering knowledge. Oddly enough, some early settlers believed that the direction a cabin faced could influence how harsh the winter felt inside, preferring southward orientations even when wind exposure increased. Historians still argue whether this preference was symbolic, practical, or simply tradition carried across migrations without question. You place your hand near the wood of one cabin wall. The surface is rough cold and slightly uneven, as if the timber itself has been reshaped by repeated freezing cycles. There is a faint sound inside, maybe a pot shifting or a chair being moved. Life continues behind these walls, but it feels compressed, condensed into smaller movements and quieter rhythms. You notice smoke leaking from a chimney, above thin and unstable. It rises for a moment, then bends sideways as wind presses against it. The air carries a mixture of pine ash and animal fat used for burning. It is not pleasant, but it is familiar to those who have adapted to it. Inside, warmth is not a constant. It is something that must be created and maintained. Fireplaces are the center of survival here, and every cabin revolves around them. The hearth is not only for cooking or comfort, but for preventing the structure itself from becoming unlivable. You can almost feel the tension of it. The constant need to keep embers alive through long nights when wood burns too quickly and supply runs low. One curious footnote from settler diaries describes families taking turns sleeping near the fire, rotating positions through the night, so no one person bore the coldest hours alone. It was not written as hardship alone, but as routine, something accepted as normal structure of winter life. You walk along the edge of the settlement. Snow is packed tightly here from repeated footsteps. The sound under your boots is slightly different now, more compact, almost solid. You pass stacked firewood piles covered in tarps or animal hides. Each pile is carefully measured in the mind of its owner, because running out of fuel is not an inconvenience. It is a direct threat. Inside one open doorway, you glimpse movement. A woman kneels near a hearth, adjusting iron tools over firelight. A child sits nearby, turning something slowly in their hands, perhaps a carved piece of wood or bone. Their faces are lit by flickering orange glow that feels almost unreal compared to the blue cold outside. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival depended more on physical adaptation or communal organization. Some argue that technology of the time was sufficient if properly managed, while others suggest that without tight social cooperation, even basic winters would have been catastrophic for isolated families. You step back into the open air again, and the cold greets you immediately, not aggressively, but without compromise. It does not care how long you stay or how far you have traveled. It simply continues. A gust of wind passes through the settlement, and for a brief moment, everything seems to pause. Smoke leans in one direction, then corrects itself. A loose rope taps softly against a wooden beam. Somewhere, a dog shifts position, curling tighter against the cold. You notice how carefully people move here. No unnecessary gestures, no wasted energy. Even conversation, when it happens, is brief and functional. Words are not discarded, but preserved. Records confirm that in many frontier settlements, wood consumption during peak winter months was measured with extreme precision, sometimes recorded daily in shared logs to prevent shortages. Oddly enough, some communities developed informal agreements about firewood sharing, ensuring that no single household exhausted resources too quickly. Historians still argue whether these agreements were primarily cooperative or enforced through social pressure rather than formal rules. You continue walking, and the settlement begins to thin again. Cabins become fewer, more spaced apart. Beyond them lies open snowfield once more, a reminder that human presence here is always temporary against the scale of land and season. The sky shifts slightly darker, not yet storm level, but heavy enough that shadows feel muted. The horizon is harder to distinguish now, as if distance itself is being gently erased. You pause near a small outbuilding, half storage, half shelter. Inside you see tools hanging from wooden hooks. Metal items reflect faint light, each one carefully maintained. Rust is not just an inconvenience here. It is a form of loss, slow but certain. One curious footnote mentions that some settlers believed metal tools needed to be rested away from extreme cold to prevent brittleness. And while there is some truth in material science regarding temperature effects on metal, the practice often became ritualized beyond practical necessity. The wind shifts again. You feel it more directly now, not stronger, but closer, as if the atmosphere itself is compressing. Snow begins to drift sideways instead of falling straight. It is subtle at first, but unmistakable to those who have lived here long enough. You look back toward the cabins. People are beginning to notice. A few figures step outside, scanning the sky. Movements become slightly faster, more deliberate. Something is being assessed without words. Scholars bicker over whether frontier communities developed an intuitive group awareness of weather changes, or whether individuals simply followed the reactions of more experienced members. There is no clear agreement, but most accounts suggest a shared recognition process that required little verbal communication. You feel it now, too. The air has changed again. Not yet a storm, but no longer just winter either. It is the moment before everything decides what kind of winter this will become. You notice it first, not through sight, but through resistance. The air itself feels slightly heavier, as if the world has added a layer you cannot quite see. The frontier settlement behind you is no longer simply living under winter conditions. It is now negotiating with something approaching permanence, as though the cold has begun to settle in for longer than expected. You step closer to the center of activity again, where the fire pits are burning steadily, though even the flames seem smaller than before. The wood feeding them is carefully rationed. Each log placed on the fire is done with intention, almost ceremony. There is no sense of waste here, not even in movement. Records confirm that frontier families often calculated firewood consumption with surprising precision, sometimes estimating how many days a stack could last based on expected temperature drops. Oddly enough, some accounts describe people comparing wood piles between households as informal indicators of preparedness, almost like a quiet form of social judgment. Historians still argue whether this practice reflected cooperation or subtle competition for survival credibility within tight communities. You feel the heat from the fire as you approach, but it does not fully reach you. Warmth here behaves differently. It is localized, fragile, contained within small invisible boundaries that fade within a few steps. The cold does not retreat. It simply waits just beyond the reach of flame. A man kneels beside a stack of logs, splitting one carefully with a hatchet. The sound is sharp, echoing briefly before being absorbed by the snow. Each piece is inspected before being added to the pile. Not all wood burns equally, and in this environment, that difference matters. You realize how central fire has become to everything. It is not just comfort. It is structure. It determines where people sit, how long they stay awake, even how conversations unfold. Around the fire time feels slightly less harsh, Away from it, everything slows and stiffens. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes families keeping a fire rotation schedule where someone was always assigned responsibility for tending flames through the night. In some cases, this duty rotated hourly during severe storms, ensuring no accidental extinguishing occurred while others slept. There is no consensus on how widespread this system truly was, but it appears frequently enough to suggest it was more than isolated practice. You move slightly closer to one cabin doorway where the warmth spills out in faint waves. Inside, you can see silhouettes moving slowly, deliberately. A kettle hangs above the hearth, releasing thin steam that disappears quickly into the air. The interior feels smaller than expected, and as if the cold has compressed the space. Outside again, you notice how sound behaves differently. The crackle of fire is clearer, the creak of wood sharper. Even breathing sounds more pronounced in this cold air. Everything becomes audible because silence is so complete. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival depended more on resource management or psychological endurance. Some argue that material scarcity defined every decision, while others suggest that the true struggle was maintaining morale through endless repetition of cold seasons. You glance toward the edge of the settlement. Snow has begun to shift again lightly, at first almost like dust being moved across a surface. The wind is no longer consistent. It changes direction and in subtle pulses, as if something larger is moving through the atmosphere and altering its flow. People begin to respond without speaking. A door closes slightly faster than before. A bundle of firewood is moved closer to a shelter entrance. Someone checks a rope securing a roof beam. These are not panic responses. They are adjustments refined through experience. Records confirm that frontier settlers developed highly sensitive awareness to atmospheric shifts, often noticing changes hours before visible storms arrived. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that animals inside settlements became restless before humans fully recognized incoming weather, particularly dogs and horses. Historians still argue whether this was due to environmental sensitivity or retrospective interpretation of behavior during remembered storms. You feel a drop in temperature now, not dramatic, but noticeable. The kind of change that settles into skin rather than air. The sky above is flattening again, losing texture. Light diffuses more evenly, reducing contrast between ground and horizon. The fire continues to burn, but even it seems slightly subdued, not weaker, just contained, as if the surrounding cold is adjusting its distance. A woman nearby adjusts a thick blanket around her shoulders and glances upward. Her expression is not alarmed but attentive. She has seen this pattern before. Everyone here has. One curious footnote mentions that some settlers developed personal storm memories, mental records of previous weather events used to predict future severity. While not scientifically structured, these recollections often influence decisions about travel supply use and sheltering behavior. You step back from the fire again, and immediately the cold reclaims the space around you. It is not aggressive, it is consistent. That consistency is what makes it powerful. The settlement feels quieter now, not empty, but focused. Every movement is slightly more purposeful. Every glance carries information. Scholars bicker over whether this collective attentiveness was a form of early environmental intelligence or simply survival instinct shaped into habit over generations. There is no final answer, only patterns repeated across many accounts. You look toward the horizon once more. The line between sky and land is fading again. Snow is beginning to drift in a different rhythm, slower, denser, almost like it is preparing itself rather than falling freely. The frontier is not fully storm yet, but it is no longer calm, and everyone here knows that what comes next will decide how long warmth can survive. You feel the change before you fully see it, as if the frontier winter has decided to shift its attention toward you again. The air tightens slightly around your body, not in pressure alone, but in texture. Every breath feels like it has been gently filtered through colder layers of the world. You walk away from the firelight now, and the difference is immediate. Warmth does not follow you. It never really did. It only existed where it was actively maintained. Beyond that fragile boundary, the cold resumes its quiet authority. Around you, people are adjusting to the same subtle transition. A man pulls his collar higher against his neck. A woman wraps an extra layer of wool around a child's shoulders. No one speaks about it directly. There is no need. Everyone recognizes the pattern. Records confirm that frontier clothing systems in the 1800s relied heavily on layered wool animal hides, and hand-stitched insulation techniques passed through generations of necessity rather than formal design. Oddly enough, some settlers preferred heavier garments even when they restricted movement, believing that physical restriction helped conserve body heat more effectively. Historians still argue whether this belief was physiologically accurate or simply a psychological comfort strategy during prolonged exposure to cold. You notice your own body reacting now. The sensation of weight increases as you imagine these layers being placed on you: thick wool shirts, fur-lined coats, tightly wrapped scarves, and boots reinforced with stitched leather. Each layer is not just protection, but negotiation with the environment. A nearby settler shakes snow from a heavy coat, and the motion is slow, deliberate. The fabric is stiff from repeated freezing cycles. Even clothing behaves differently here. It does not flow easily. It holds shape, resists movement, and sometimes cracks faintly when bent. One curious footnote from Frontier Diaries describes how families often prioritized clothing repair as urgently as food preparation, sometimes spending entire evenings stitching fur linings back into coats before the next storm cycle arrived. In some regions, clothing maintenance was considered as critical as firewood management. You continue walking through the settlement's edge where the cabins are more spaced apart again. The wind is beginning to carry sharper edges now, brushing across exposed skin with a more intentional presence. It is not yet violent, but it is no longer passive. You pass a small outdoor area where clothing is hung on lines between wooden posts. The garments are stiff, almost sculptural, shaped by frozen moisture. Nothing flutters. Everything holds still, as if even fabric has learned restraint. Scholars bicker over whether frontier clothing evolution was primarily driven by European heritage adaptation or by rapid improvisation in response to North American climate extremes. Some argue that settlers relied too heavily on inherited garments unsuitable for prolonged exposure, while others suggest that innovation happened faster than records can fully capture. You notice a man adjusting moccasins at the edge of a cabin step. His fingers move carefully, checking seams, tightening bindings. Nearby, a woman inspects gloves with small, practiced motions, ensuring no gaps remain where cold might enter. The cold here does not attack all at once. It searches. It finds weaknesses. That is what makes preparation so essential. Records confirm that frostbite prevention was a constant concern among frontier communities, particularly for those who traveled long distances or worked outdoors. Oddly enough, some settlers believed that rubbing exposed skin with animal fat could prevent freezing damage, a practice partially rooted in real insulating properties, but often exaggerated in application. Historians still argue whether such methods were effective or merely delayed symptoms long enough to create false confidence. You flex your own imagined hands, now sensing how quickly numbness would begin to spread in this environment if left unprotected. Even the idea of stillness becomes dangerous. A gust of wind moves through the settlement, again slightly stronger than before. It does not roar. It slides. It presses against surfaces, testing them. You see smoke from chimneys bending lower, no longer rising freely. The firelight inside cabins flickers differently, reacting to unseen pressure shifts. Someone closes a door with more force than before. Another person checks a latch twice. These are not dramatic actions. They are adjustments in rhythm, with something larger approaching. You pause near a stacked supply area. Bundles of fabric, dried hides, and repaired garments are arranged carefully under partial cover. Everything here has been preserved with intention. Nothing is excess. Everything has purpose. One curious footnote mentions that some frontier families created winter garment inventories, tracking each item of clothing as carefully as food stores, sometimes even assigning emotional value to specific coats or blankets that had survived multiple winters. You begin to understand now that survival here is not only about warmth, it is about continuity. The ability to preserve what keeps you alive long enough to face the next change. The sky above is shifting again, slowly becoming heavier in tone. The light diffuses, further flattening shadows across the snow. Distance becomes harder to judge. And still no one here reacts with surprise, only recognition. They have seen this before, and they know what comes next is never gentle. The settlement feels quieter again, but it is not true silence. It is the kind of silence that has been shaped by expectation, as if every sound is being held back deliberately, waiting for permission to exist. You can feel it in the way people move, in the way smoke curls lower from chimneys, in the way even footsteps seem to shorten their stride. You find yourself drifting toward the food storage areas now, where survival becomes something you can actually see rather than just feel in the air. Wooden crates, ceramic jars, and wrapped bundles are arranged under thick coverings, protected not just from theft, but from temperature itself. Everything here is measured, accounted for, and mentally rehearsed by those who depend on it. Records confirm that frontier households often relied on salted meats, dried beans, preserved grains, and frozen storage methods during long winter months when fresh food became nearly impossible to obtain. Oddly enough, some settlers discovered that naturally frozen outdoor storage sometimes preserved food better than indoor cellars, as long as animals and scavengers could be kept away. Historians still argue whether this reliance on natural refrigeration was an intentional adaptation or a fortunate discovery repeated across multiple regions. You notice how food is not just stored, but emotionally weighted. A sack of grain is not simply calories, it is time. It is future days. It is the difference between comfort and scarcity. People here understand that instinctively, even without formal measurement systems. A woman lifts the lid of a storage barrel, checks inside briefly, then closes it again with careful precision. There is no waste in her movement. Every action is rehearsed by necessity. Nearby, a man counts wrapped portions of dried meat, his fingers moving slowly, as if counting too quickly might change the total. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes how families sometimes labeled food portions not by weight or quantity alone, but by expected survival days, estimating how long each stored item might extend household endurance during extended storms. You move slightly deeper into the storage area, where the air is cooler, even more stable than outside. The smell here is subtle, but distinct: dried herbs, cured meat, and wood smoke absorbed into fabric and timber. It is a scent that signals preparation more than comfort. Scholars bicker over whether frontier food preservation practices were driven more by inherited European techniques or rapid innovation born from necessity. Some argue that settlers simply adapted familiar methods, while others suggest that the extreme climate forced entirely new systems of food management within a single generation. You watch as someone carefully slices frozen meat, working slowly so that the blade does not crack the material. Everything here requires patience. Even cutting food becomes a controlled process. Outside the storage area, the wind shifts again. It brushes along the edges of buildings, testing them gently before moving on. Snow is beginning to accumulate more evenly, now smoothing out irregularities in the landscape. You realize how food storage is not separate from weather. It is part of it. The cold itself becomes a tool, a collaborator in preservation, even while it simultaneously threatens life. A child nearby carries a small bundle of dried goods, walking carefully so as not to drop anything. The seriousness in their movement reflects how early survival responsibilities begin here, not as punishment, but as normal life structure. Records confirm that frontier children often participated in food preparation and storage tasks at remarkably young ages, especially during harsh winters, when every member of a household contributed to survival logistics. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that children developed strong familiarity with rationing concepts before fully understanding formal arithmetic. Historians still argue whether this early exposure shaped long-term cognitive development in frontier populations. You step back toward the open air again, and the cold greets you immediately, unchanged in tone, but slightly more persistent in presence. It feels closer now, as if it has learned the boundaries of the settlement more precisely. Smoke from multiple cabins now leans in the same direction, all responding to the same atmospheric pressure shift. The sky has flattened further, losing most remaining contrast. Even distant trees appear softened, their edges less defined. You hear a faint creak of wood under snow weight. Somewhere, a rope tightens under strain. These small sounds are becoming more frequent, forming a kind of pre-language for weather. One curious footnote mentions that some settlers believed storms could be predicted by the taste of air, describing a metallic or sharp sensation before heavy snowfall. While this is not scientifically supported, modern interpretations suggest they may have been sensing humidity and pressure changes indirectly through respiratory perception. You pause near the center of the settlement again. People are no longer just maintaining routine, they are adjusting to anticipation. Firewood is moved closer to doorways. Extra coverings are brought inside. Animals are checked and repositioned. Scholars bicker over whether this kind of collective readiness was learned through repeated exposure or whether it reflects a deeper instinctual response to environmental threat. There is no consensus, only patterns repeated across different frontier regions. You feel it now, too, the subtle tightening of everything around you. Not fear exactly, but alignment, as if the entire settlement has begun to move in quiet coordination with something approaching from beyond sight. The cold is not increasing dramatically, it is becoming organized. And that is when winter becomes something more than weather. You leave the storage areas behind, but the sense of preparation follows you like a shadow that does not belong to any single person. The settlement is no longer simply reacting to winter. It is now behaving as if winter itself has begun to think ahead. You move toward the edge of the camp, where the land opens again into forested silence. The trees here are darker, taller, and more spaced apart than before, their branches carrying thin layers of snow that no longer fall away easily. The air feels different once you step beneath them, as if the canopy holds the cold closer to the ground. Records confirm that frontier hunters often used winter conditions to their advantage, since animal tracks were more visible in fresh snow, and movement through frozen terrain left clearer signs of passage. Oddly enough, some hunting logs mention that certain hunters preferred deep winter, not for ease, but for silence, claiming that snow softened the world enough to make tracking feel almost instinctive. Historians still argue whether this preference reflects practical efficiency or a psychological adaptation to isolation and quiet. You walk deeper into the forest now, and the settlement fades behind you. The sounds of human activity dissolve into a softer background, replaced by wind moving through bare branches and the occasional distant crack of ice shifting in unseen places. Every step you take becomes more deliberate. The snow here is uneven, layered in places where wind has sculpted small ridges and depressions. You notice how easily the environment hides its own structure. What looks stable may conceal hollows beneath. A faint set of tracks appears ahead. They are not fresh, but not fully erased either, perhaps made earlier in the day. You follow them instinctively, understanding how easily direction becomes dependent on traces left behind by others. One curious footnote from frontier accounts describes hunters reading snow not only for tracks, but for emotional interpretation, believing that disturbed snow patterns could indicate not just direction of movement, but the urgency of animals fleeing danger. While this is not supported by modern science, it reveals how deeply observation became intertwined with intuition in survival conditions. You begin to hear something different now. Not sound exactly, but absence of it. The forest has a kind of suspended quality. Even the wind seems to move more carefully here, as if respecting boundaries you cannot see. A rabbit suddenly darts across your path, its movement quick and precise, disappearing into brush almost instantly. The moment is brief, but it sharpens your awareness. In this environment, everything that moves does so with purpose. Scholars bicker over whether frontier hunters developed enhanced perception through practice, or whether survival pressure simply filtered those who already had stronger observational skills. There is no definitive answer, only patterns inferred from repeated accounts of successful tracking in extreme conditions. You continue following the faint trail. It leads toward a small clearing where the trees open slightly. Here the snow is deep or untouched in places, except for scattered disturbances. The light feels different again, filtered through branches in a way that creates shifting patterns on the ground. You notice subtle signs of animal presence now: broken twigs, slight depressions, the faint outline of movement paths that are already fading. Records confirm that hunting in frontier winter often required reading multiple layers of evidence simultaneously, including temperature changes, snow consistency, and even subtle variations in wind direction that could alter scent trails. Oddly enough, some hunters believed that silence itself was part of tracking, insisting that remaining still for long periods improved perception of movement in the environment. Historians still argue whether this reflects heightened sensory awareness or cultural interpretation of patience as a survival virtue. You crouch slightly, observing the ground more closely. The snow here holds impressions longer, shaped by colder air and reduced melting cycles. Every mark is temporary, but meaningful. A distant sound breaks the stillness, not loud, but distinct enough to register: the snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the forest. You turn your attention, slowly scanning the direction without haste. Nothing immediately visible, but the forest has changed again. The wind begins to move in uneven pulses through the trees, creating soft waves of motion across branches. Snow begins to drift more actively now, not yet falling heavily, but shifting direction in subtle patterns that suggest pressure changes in the atmosphere. One curious footnote describes hunters interpreting sudden forest silence as a warning sign of approaching weather shifts, often abandoning hunts when animal activity ceased unexpectedly. While this is partially supported by ecological behavior patterns, frontier interpretation often extended it into broader predictive belief systems. You stand still for a moment longer. Your breath becomes more visible now, curling into the air before dissolving quickly. The cold feels sharper here, not because it has increased, but because there is less human presence to soften its perception. Scholars bicker over whether frontier hunting success depended more on technical skill or environmental attunement developed through long exposure to seasonal extremes. Some argue that hunters became extensions of the landscape itself during winter months, while others suggest this is a romanticized interpretation of survival necessity. You begin to move back slowly now, retracing your path. The forest does not resist your departure, but it feels less passive than before, as if it is aware of observation. Behind you, the tracks you followed are already beginning to blur under shifting snow. The frontier remains quiet, but it is no longer still. Something is approaching its next change. You return toward the settlement, but something feels different now, as if the forest you just left has subtly adjusted the way it exists behind you. The silence is not gone, but it is rearranged less like emptiness and more like anticipation stretched across distance. As you step back into the edge of human activity, the first thing you notice is movement around livestock. Horses stand with their heads slightly lowered, breath visible in steady clouds. Cattle are clustered closer together than before, their bodies forming compact shapes against the cold wind. Even without words, you can feel that animals here respond faster than people do to changes in weather pressure. Records confirm that frontier survival depended heavily on livestock behavior, especially horses and cattle, which often reacted to atmospheric shifts before visible storms arrived. Oddly enough, some settlers believed that animals could sense direction of approaching blizzards, turning instinct into a form of prediction system. Historians still argue whether These observations were scientifically valid behavioral indicators or simply retrospective pattern recognition during extreme weather events. You walk slowly past a tethered horse. It shifts its weight, stamping lightly in the snow, not in agitation, but in readiness. Its coat is thick with frost near the edges, yet it remains steady, conditioned to endurance rather than comfort. Nearby, a man tightens a harness on a sled. His hands move quickly, but not carelessly. Every strap is checked twice. The sled itself is loaded with supplies, though not fully. There is always a balance between preparedness and mobility. Too much weight means slower travel. Too little means vulnerability. One curious footnote from Frontier Diaries mentions that some settlers developed routines for storm readiness, loading, arranging sleds and wagons in configurations that could be moved instantly if conditions worsened suddenly. While not formally standardized, these habits appeared repeatedly across different regions, suggesting shared adaptive strategies. You notice how communication within the settlement has become even more minimal. Instead of speaking, people gesture, nod, or simply act. A bucket is moved closer to a door. A rope is reinforced. A lantern is checked and repositioned. Scholars bicker over whether this reduction in verbal communication was an efficiency adaptation or a psychological response to prolonged environmental stress. Some argue that silence became functional, while others suggest it reflected emotional conservation during harsh winters. You continue through the settlement's interior path. Firelight flickers in multiple directions, now creating overlapping pools of warmth that feel like temporary islands in a cold sea. Each household maintains its own small boundary of survivable temperature. A child runs briefly between two cabins, then slows as wind increases slightly, wrapping themselves tighter in their clothing. The movement is quick, instinctive, shaped by repetition of experience rather than instruction. Records confirm that frontier children often learned environmental responsiveness earlier than formal education, developing awareness of wind direction, snow consistency, and temperature change through daily exposure. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that children were sometimes the first to notice approaching storms, alerting adults through behavioral shifts rather than verbal warnings. You pause near a central storage shed again. The structure looks unchanged, but now you see it differently. It is not just storage, it is buffer, a physical attempt to negotiate uncertainty. Inside movement continues quietly. Supplies are checked again, not because anything is wrong, but because repetition creates reassurance. Every item accounted for becomes a small reduction in anxiety. You step back outside and immediately feel the wind shift again. Not stronger, but lower. It travels closer to ground level, now brushing across surfaces rather than passing above them. Snow begins to move in faint horizontal streaks. One curious footnote describes settlers interpreting wind direction changes as indicators of storm type, believing that low ground winds often preceded longer, more sustained blizzards, while higher winds indicated shorter but more intense bursts. While partially aligned with meteorological patterns, these interpretations were inconsistent and regionally varied. You look toward the horizon again. The sky is no longer just gray. It has depth, now layered tones that suggest movement within the atmosphere itself. Light diffuses unevenly, creating a soft gradient that flattens distance. Scholars bicker over whether frontier weather interpretation was more predictive intuition or accumulated experiential knowledge. Some argue that settlers developed surprisingly accurate forecasting abilities through constant exposure, while others suggest that confirmation bias shaped historical narratives of accurate prediction. You feel the settlement settle into a new rhythm again. Not panic, not calm, something between. A state of readiness that exists only when change is expected but not yet arrived. The horses shift again. The firelight flickers again. The wind continues its slow descent toward the ground. And in that layered quiet, everything waits. You begin to notice that nothing in this frontier winter changes all at once. It always arrives in stages, like a decision the land makes slowly enough for those paying attention to feel each step of it. You are still within the settlement, but now even the air between buildings feels slightly recalibrated, as if pressure has shifted just enough to demand attention. You walk toward the outer edge again, where visibility opens into rolling snowfields and distant tree lines. The horizon is still there, but it feels less like a boundary and more like a suggestion. The wind moves across it in long, shallow currents, smoothing everything it touches. Records confirm that frontier settlers relied heavily on environmental reading techniques, observing not only sky and wind, but also subtle changes in animal stillness, snow texture, and even the sound quality of distant movement. Oddly enough, some journals describe people distinguishing weather patterns by listening to how footsteps sounded on frozen ground, noting that denser cold produced sharper, more brittle echoes. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were genuinely perceptive or influenced by the human tendency to find meaning in repetitive environmental stress. You stop walking for a moment. The snow beneath you is compacted but uneven, shaped by repeated passage. When you lift your foot slightly and set it down again, the sound is different than before. Sharper, more contained. The world feels like it has tightened its acoustics. A faint line of trees in the distance appears darker than before, not because they have changed, but because the light has softened. Everything is losing contrast gradually, like a fading photograph that refuses to disappear completely. You begin to understand how frontier survival depended on reading the world in layers, not just what is visible, but what is implied. Not just what moves, but what stops moving. One curious footnote from settler accounts mentions that experienced frontiersmen could hear snow before it arrived, describing a subtle dampening of ambient sound that often preceded heavier snowfall. While modern interpretation suggests this may relate to humidity and atmospheric pressure affecting sound travel, the language used in those accounts reflects a deeply sensory relationship with environment. You continue forward again, and the snow becomes slightly softer underfoot. Not deeper, but less resistant. The surface seems to accept your weight more willingly, as if its structure is loosening. A distant sound reaches you. It is not distinct enough to identify immediately. It could be wind shifting through hollow spaces in the trees, or something moving across frozen ground far away. In this environment, certainty is always delayed. Scholars bicker over whether frontier environmental awareness was a refined skill developed through necessity or a form of heightened survival anxiety that caused overinterpretation of subtle signals. Some argue that settlers became extraordinarily attuned to ecological cues, while others suggest that memory reconstruction played a major role in shaping recorded accuracy. You glance upward again. The sky is no longer simply layered, it feels structured, as if invisible currents are organizing cloud movement into slow, deliberate formations. Light spreads unevenly across it, creating soft zones of brightness and shadow. You notice now how even your breathing seems to synchronize with the environment. Each exhale disappears slightly faster than before, as though the air is absorbing it more efficiently. A group of settlers passes nearby, moving with purpose, but not urgency. One of them pauses briefly, looking at the wind direction. Another adjusts a scarf tighter around their face. No words are exchanged. They already understand the message the environment is sending. Records confirm that frontier communities often developed shared observational habits, where individuals acted based on collective environmental reading rather than explicit instruction. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that certain families could coordinate storm preparation almost silently, responding to environmental cues with near-uniform timing. Historians still argue whether this reflects social cohesion or long-term behavioral conditioning under repeated extreme conditions. You step slightly aside as they pass. Their movement leaves faint trails in the snow that begin to soften almost immediately. The wind does not erase them abruptly, it simply absorbs them gradually. The settlement behind you is quieter again, but it is not less active. Activity has simply become more inward. Doors close more carefully. Objects are handled with more control. Even animals seem to adjust their posture in anticipation of something not yet fully visible. One curious footnote describes settlers observing that storms were often preceded not by dramatic change, but by a reduction in unnecessary motion within the environment, as if nature itself conserved energy before release. While poetic in description, this observation aligns loosely with known atmospheric patterns involving pressure stabilization prior to system shifts. You feel it again now, the subtle compression of space. Not physical pressure, but perceptual narrowing. The world feels slightly closer, as if distance itself is being drawn inward. The wind lowers once more, moving across the ground in long, uninterrupted lines. Snow begins to drift in a more coordinated pattern, no longer random but directional. Scholars bicker over whether frontier settlers experienced genuine predictive intuition or whether repeated exposure created strong associative memory that felt like foresight. There is no final consensus, only overlapping interpretations of survival behavior under extreme conditions. You stand still for a moment longer. The settlement behind you, the open field ahead, and the sky above, all seem to align into a single, quiet expectation. Nothing has fully arrived yet, but everything is already preparing for it. You realize, almost without realizing it, that the frontier has stopped feeling like separate pieces of land and sky. Everything is beginning to behave as one continuous system, now responding together to something that is not yet fully visible but already fully influential. Even your sense of direction feels less reliable, as if the world is subtly rearranging its internal map. You move a little farther from the settlement, and the snow beneath your feet changes again. It is not deeper but denser, as if each step compresses more resistance into a smaller space. The sound it makes is softer than before, almost muffled, like the ground is trying not to echo your presence too loudly. Records confirm that frontier travelers often described sudden whiteout conditions as one of the most disorienting experiences in winter travel, where visibility could collapse within moments, and familiar landmarks would disappear entirely. Oddly enough, some accounts mention that even experienced guides sometimes became unsure of direction when snow density reached certain thresholds, relying instead on wind feel and temperature gradients. Historians still argue whether these failures were due to genuine navigational limitations or psychological stress impairing perception during extreme weather transitions. You pause for a moment. The horizon, which was already faint, is now dissolving further. The trees ahead are still visible, but their outlines are no longer stable. They seem to shift slightly each time you look at them, as if the space between you and them is no longer fixed. A sudden gust passes through, not strong, but dense. It carries snow sideways across your field of view, briefly obscuring everything beyond a few meters. When it clears, the world feels subtly altered, not different in structure, but in clarity. One curious footnote from Frontier Diaries describes travelers becoming disoriented, not only when visibility dropped, but when wind patterns shifted direction repeatedly within short intervals, creating what they called turning air, where orientation became unreliable, even without full whiteout conditions. You begin to walk again slowly, carefully. Each step now feels like it must be confirmed before continuing. The environment is no longer just cold. It is variable, unstable in its predictability. Scholars bicker over whether whiteout disorientation in frontier travel was primarily a visual phenomenon or whether auditory and thermal cues played an equal role in navigation breakdown. Some argue that sound dampening and heavy snow contributed significantly to confusion, while others emphasize the psychological effects of featureless terrain on spatial awareness. You notice that even distant sounds have changed. The settlement behind you is now almost entirely muted, not because it has disappeared, but because the snow between you and it has thickened acoustically. It feels like sound is being absorbed rather than transmitted. Your breath becomes more visible now. Each exhale lingers slightly longer before fading. The air feels saturated not with moisture alone, but with suspended motion. Ahead, the forest line begins to blur again. What was once distinct separation between open field and trees is now a gradual transition. Boundaries are dissolving. Records confirm that whiteout conditions often created situations where travelers could no longer distinguish between ground and sky, leading to a loss of depth perception and directional certainty. Oddly enough, some frontier accounts mention that individuals would sometimes rely on tactile feedback from wind direction on skin as a last form of navigation. Historians still argue whether this method had any consistent reliability or whether it simply provided psychological reassurance during moments of extreme disorientation. You stop again. The world feels quieter now, but not calmer. The silence is layered, as if multiple forms of quiet are overlapping. A faint sound appears somewhere to your left. It is indistinct. It could be movement through snow or wind passing through uneven terrain. You turn your head slightly, but there is nothing immediately visible. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteouts were experienced as sudden collapses of visibility or gradual reductions that only became apparent once orientation was already compromised. There is no consensus, only varying descriptions shaped by individual encounters. The wind shifts again lower this time. It moves across the ground in long, continuous sheets, lifting loose snow into thin horizontal streams. The effect is not violent, but it is persistent, like the environment is slowly erasing reference points. You realize now that the settlement is no longer visible behind you, not entirely gone, but absorbed into the same whiteness that is now expanding around you. One curious footnote describes travelers in whiteout conditions, occasionally stopping movement, entirely choosing stillness over navigation error, waiting for wind or visibility to stabilize before continuing. While this tactic is documented, its effectiveness remains debated among historians studying frontier survival strategies. You stand still. The world continues moving without offering clarity, and for the first time you are no longer sure where movement should begin again. You remain still for a moment longer than you intended, and in that stillness, something subtle begins to change. It is not the storm that shifts first, but your perception of being inside it. The white around you feels less like weather and more like a continuous surface that extends in every direction without interruption. You take a careful step forward again. The ground is still there, but it is no longer visually reliable. Each movement becomes an act of trust rather than observation. The frontier has entered a state where sight is no longer the primary sense of survival. Records confirm that prolonged exposure to frontier isolation and winter conditions often produced what settlers described as time softening, a psychological effect where hours lost definition and days blended into one another during extended storms. Oddly enough, some diaries mention individuals becoming unsure whether they had eaten recently or simply remembered eating, due to disrupted routine markers. Historians still argue whether this reflects true cognitive distortion or retrospective exaggeration in written accounts meant to convey hardship. You feel something similar now, even if only in a mild form. The absence of landmarks makes time feel thinner. The snow does not change enough to mark progression. Even the wind lacks consistent rhythm, shifting in ways that do not allow prediction. A faint shape appears ahead, then dissolves again. It could be a tree, or it could be your mind reconstructing what it expects to see. In this environment, imagination and reality begin to overlap without clear boundary. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers in whiteout conditions, occasionally speaking aloud simply to confirm their own presence in space, using their voice as a form of spatial anchoring when visual reference failed. While not universally practiced, this habit appears across multiple independent accounts, suggesting a shared psychological coping mechanism. You do not speak. Instead, you listen. The snow absorbs most sound, but not all of it. There is still the faint pressure of wind moving close to the ground, and the occasional soft compression beneath your boots. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout disorientation was primarily sensory deprivation, or whether it involved deeper cognitive recalibration caused by sustained environmental monotony. Some argue that the human brain struggles to maintain spatial models when external input becomes uniform, while others suggest that experience allows adaptation beyond initial disorientation. You continue walking slowly, carefully, each step measured. There is no urgency now, only continuity. The idea of direction has become abstract, something you infer rather than observe. The wind changes again, but subtly. It no longer sweeps uniformly. Instead, it forms uneven pockets areas where snow falls thicker and others where it briefly thins. These variations are small but noticeable if you remain attentive long enough. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often learn to interpret such micro-variations in snow density as indicators of terrain or wind barriers, though accuracy varied significantly depending on conditions. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals developed personal storm maps in memory, constructed entirely from sensory impressions rather than visual landmarks. Historians still argue whether these mental models improved survival outcomes or simply gave structure to otherwise chaotic experiences. You pause again. The world feels suspended not in silence, but in uniformity. Everything looks the same, yet nothing feels stable. A distant sound emerges. It is faint, almost indistinguishable from wind, but it carries a slightly different tone. You cannot place its origin. It might be movement, or it might be the storm itself reshaping its internal structure. You realize now that isolation in this environment is not just physical, it is perceptual. Even awareness begins to contract when external variety disappears. One curious footnote describes settlers who claim to recognize familiar directions during whiteouts, based solely on wind pressure against the side of their face, suggesting an adaptive form of directional sensitivity. While this is difficult to verify, it reflects the extent to which survival demanded reliance on non-visual cues. You shift your stance slightly. The ground feels consistent, but consistency is no longer reassuring. It is simply the only available reference. Scholars bicker over whether frontier psychological endurance during whiteouts was a result of training necessity or a gradual numbing of sensory expectation. There is no definitive answer, only layered interpretations built from fragmented accounts. The white continues without interruption. No edges, no clear transitions, just presence without shape. And within that presence you realize something quiet but important. The storm is no longer approaching. It is already here and you are inside it. Inside the whiteout, time stops behaving like something you can rely on. It does not disappear, but it loosens its grip, stretching and folding in ways that make it difficult to trust your own sense of duration. You might have walked for minutes or much longer, yet nothing around you offers confirmation. The snow continues in a steady, unbroken presence, not falling in visible flakes anymore, but existing as density in the air itself. It presses against your coat, your face, your awareness. Even blinking feels like a small interruption in a larger, uninterrupted field of white. Records confirm that frontier mail riders and messengers were among the most vulnerable travelers during sudden blizzards, often forced to continue movement without visible landmarks for guidance. Oddly enough, some accounts describe riders tying physical lines between trees or posts, when possible using rope as a literal memory of direction. Historians still argue whether such methods were widely effective or only occasionally successful under very specific terrain conditions. You try to orient yourself again, but orientation no longer feels like a stable concept. Forward and backward lose their distinction. Even the idea of standing still becomes ambiguous, as if the environment itself is moving around you rather than you moving through it. A faint pressure shift passes across your left side. It might be wind, or it might be the subtle slope of terrain hidden beneath snow. In normal conditions, this would be a simple observation. Here, it becomes uncertain data. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers using repeated tapping of walking sticks or tools against frozen ground to create auditory feedback loops, helping them detect changes in terrain beneath snow cover. While not universally practiced, this method appears in multiple independent accounts across regions with similar climates. You continue forward slowly. Each step is careful not because of fear, but because certainty has become unavailable. The snow beneath you responds with a muted crunch, almost absorbed before it can fully express itself. Scholars bicker over whether whiteout navigation relied more on tactile environmental cues or whether it was primarily an exercise in memorized spatial estimation from prior movement. Some argue that experienced travelers developed internal mapping systems based on time and effort rather than visual input, while others suggest that success rates were too inconsistent to support structured technique. You feel your breathing become more noticeable, not louder, but more present. In the absence of external reference points, internal rhythms become easier to detect. Breath, step, pause, repeat. The wind shifts again, but this time it carries a slightly different quality. It is not directional in the usual sense. It feels layered, as if multiple air currents are crossing each other at different heights above the ground. Records confirm that extreme whiteout conditions often created vertical wind stratification, where surface-level airflow differed significantly from higher atmospheric movement. Oddly enough, some frontier accounts mention travelers feeling two winds at once, one at face level and another above head height, contributing to spatial confusion. Historians still argue whether these descriptions reflect accurate environmental perception or metaphorical language used to express disorientation. You stop for a moment, not because you have chosen to, but because movement no longer provides clarity. Stillness offers no answers either, but it reduces variables. The white around you does not change. It does not intensify or weaken. It simply continues. A distant sound appears again, slightly closer this time, or perhaps simply clearer. It could be movement through snow or wind passing through uneven terrain. You cannot assign certainty to it. One curious footnote describes settlers experiencing auditory illusions during prolonged whiteouts, where environmental sounds were misinterpreted as proximity-based signals due to lack of visual grounding. While modern analysis suggests this may relate to sound reflection in dense snowfall, the historical accounts remain inconsistent. You shift your weight carefully. The ground feels stable, but stability is no longer visible. It is only assumed. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival in whiteout conditions depended on physical endurance, cognitive resilience, or simply statistical chance. Some argue that many outcomes were determined by proximity to shelter. At the moment, storms intensified, while others emphasize the skill of those who successfully navigated back to known locations under near-zero visibility. You continue moving again slowly, deliberately. There is no destination visible, but there is motion, and motion here is still meaning. The white begins to feel less like emptiness and more like a medium, something you exist within rather than travel through. And in that realization, the storm no longer feels like an event you entered. It feels like a condition that has absorbed you completely. You realize, somewhere deep in the quiet logic of survival, that movement in a whiteout is no longer about reaching a destination. It is about preventing disappearance. Standing still too long begins to feel like dissolving into the same white that surrounds everything, as if identity itself depends on motion. You take another careful step, then another. The ground is still beneath you, but it offers no reassurance beyond immediate contact. There is no horizon, no tree line, no cabin silhouette to anchor your direction, only a continuous featureless field that stretches in every direction equally. Records confirm that frontier travelers often became disoriented within minutes of full whiteout conditions, especially when wind erased all visible landmarks. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals relying on counting steps or timed breathing patterns to maintain a sense of progression. Historians still argue whether such techniques were effective navigation tools or simply psychological anchors that reduced panic during sensory deprivation. You begin to notice your own rhythm now. Step, pause, breath, step. The repetition does not guide you anywhere specific, but it prevents the sensation of drifting without structure. A faint variation in snow density passes beneath your boots, slightly firmer, then softer again. It is subtle, but in this environment, subtlety becomes information. You lower your stance slightly, feeling the ground more carefully with each step. One curious footnote from Frontier Diaries describes travelers using poles or sticks to probe ahead during whiteouts, not only to test depth, but also to detect hidden slopes or frozen obstacles beneath snow layers. While simple in concept, this technique appears repeatedly across survival accounts, suggesting its widespread adoption in extreme conditions. You continue forward. The wind presses closer now, not increasing in force, but in presence. It feels like it occupies more of the space around you, reducing the empty gaps that once existed between gusts. Scholars bicker over whether whiteout navigation was primarily instinctual or whether it involved learned spatial memory from repeated travel along known routes. Some argue that individuals unconsciously reconstructed terrain from prior experience, while others suggest that survival often depended more on chance alignment with familiar direction than deliberate orientation. You stop again briefly. The world does not change when you stop, but your awareness of it becomes sharper. The absence of visual reference forces attention inward toward sensation rather than sight. Breath becomes a marker. So does temperature on exposed skin. So does the faint resistance of wind against your coat. These become the only reliable data points. The snow shifts again, slightly heavier for a moment, then lightens. It is not consistent enough to predict, only enough to notice. Records confirm that prolonged exposure to whiteout conditions often led travelers to rely on incremental environmental changes rather than fixed landmarks, creating a form of moment-to-moment navigation. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that experienced frontiersmen could detect directional drift in wind patterns, even when visibility was completely absent. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine environmental sensitivity or retrospective reconstruction of successful journeys. You begin moving again, carefully adjusting your direction based on feel rather than sight. The ground does not resist you, but it does not guide you either. A faint sound appears somewhere ahead. It is not distinct, but it carries a slightly different texture than wind. You cannot determine its source. It might be movement, or it might be the environment reshaping itself around shifting pressure. One curious footnote describes settlers in whiteouts occasionally misidentifying natural wind echoes as human-made sounds leading to false assumptions about proximity to settlements or other travelers. While understandable under sensory deprivation, these misinterpretations often led to further disorientation. You slow slightly. Listening becomes more important than moving quickly. Scholars bicker over whether whiteout survival depended more on disciplined restraint or adaptive responsiveness to environmental ambiguity. Some argue that hesitation increased safety, while others suggest that excessive caution could prolong exposure unnecessarily. The white continues without variation. It does not intensify, nor does it recede. It simply remains. You feel now that the storm is no longer something happening around you. It is something you are continuing through step by step without interruption. You begin to understand something subtle about this frontier storm. It does not move in a single direction like a wave. It expands in layers, as if the entire environment is reorganizing itself around pressure that you cannot see but can definitely feel. Your steps continue steady but cautious. The snow beneath you is still there, still reliable in the most basic sense, yet everything above it has lost structure. There is no sky in any meaningful way anymore, only brightness without source. Records confirm that frontier travelers who became trapped in prolonged whiteout conditions often reported losing their sense of elevation, unable to distinguish whether they were moving uphill, downhill, or across level ground. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals believing they were walking in circles, even when later evidence suggested relatively straight paths. Historians still argue whether this reflects true navigational failure or the brain's tendency to impose geometric patterns onto ambiguous sensory input. You adjust your stance, slightly lowering your center of gravity, as if that could stabilize perception. It does not change the environment, but it changes how you interact with it. That small adjustment matters more here than it would anywhere else. A faint variation in wind brushes past your left side again. It is consistent enough now to notice repetition, though not consistent enough to trust direction. The air feels layered like currents crossing each other at different heights and speeds. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers attempting to use body orientation relative to wind pressure as a directional guide, noting whether cold was strongest on one side of the face or neck. While occasionally useful in open terrain, its reliability during full whiteout conditions remains questionable. You continue forward slowly, step by step. The rhythm becomes your only reference system. Movement is no longer about progress. It is about maintaining coherence. Scholars bicker over whether frontier navigation in whiteouts was primarily a physical skill or a cognitive endurance challenge, where maintaining mental structure was as important as reading environmental cues. Some argue that experienced travelers developed internal spatial models independent of external visibility, while others suggest that survival often depended on accidental reorientation rather than controlled navigation. The wind shifts again, slightly lower, now moving closer to ground level. Snow begins to drift in thicker horizontal patterns, briefly reducing even the faint tactile clarity you had been relying on. You pause, not because you are uncertain, but because the environment has become temporarily less readable. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often waited out sudden intensifications of wind within whiteouts, rather than continuing blindly recognizing that brief pauses could reduce directional drift caused by uneven ground pressure and wind push. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that stopping movement entirely for short intervals sometimes improved reorientation once conditions stabilized slightly. Historians still argue whether this reflects strategic patience or retrospective justification of survival pauses. You remain still for a moment. The world does not become clearer, but it stops shifting as quickly. Breath becomes more noticeable again. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle feels like a marker in a place that has no other markers. A faint pressure change passes through the air again, not strong enough to define, but present enough to register. The storm is still active, still layered, still reorganizing itself. One curious footnote describes settlers experiencing moments where wind direction felt inverted during whiteouts, leading them to question whether they had turned without realizing it. Modern interpretation suggests this may result from lack of visual confirmation combined with variable wind currents in complex terrain. You begin moving again, carefully matching your steps to remembered rhythm rather than perceived direction. Scholars bicker over whether whiteout endurance required more physical stamina or cognitive discipline in maintaining consistent movement patterns without external validation. There is no consensus, only overlapping theories drawn from fragmented accounts. The snow remains uniform, but your awareness of it is no longer uniform. You can sense subtle differences in density even if you cannot see them. That becomes your guide. You realize now that survival here is not about escaping the storm. It is about continuing within it long enough for conditions to eventually change. You are no longer thinking in terms of distance at all. The idea of forward has become something you assume rather than observe, a decision made from memory rather than evidence. The whiteout continues without variation, yet your awareness within it keeps shifting in subtle ways, as if you are learning to interpret a language that has no stable grammar. Your steps continue careful and measured. The ground still exists beneath you, but it no longer offers any narrative. It is simply resistance and support, nothing more. The snow above it remains a uniform field, erasing distinction wherever it settles. Records confirm that frontier travelers caught in prolonged blizzards often reported a phenomenon described as spatial flattening, where depth perception collapsed so completely that near and far felt indistinguishable. Oddly enough, some accounts mention individuals feeling as though objects or sounds were both close and distant simultaneously, depending on wind movement and body orientation. Historians still argue whether this reflects actual perceptual distortion or the brain's attempt to reconstruct missing visual information under extreme sensory deprivation. You notice your breathing again. It has become a stable anchor now, not comforting but reliable. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle becomes a quiet confirmation that you are still oriented within your own body, even if the world around you refuses to confirm anything else. A faint shift in temperature passes across your right side. It is subtle, almost indistinguishable from general cold, but it carries a slightly different quality. You turn your head slightly, though there is nothing visible to support the movement. One curious footnote from Frontier Diaries describes travelers developing an acute awareness of asymmetrical cold exposure, noting that even minor variations in wind direction across the face or neck could be used to infer environmental structure during whiteouts. While this technique appears repeatedly in survival accounts, its accuracy remains debated. Scholars bicker over whether such sensory interpretation was genuinely adaptive or whether it reflects retrospective rationalization of successful navigation events in unpredictable conditions. Some argue that humans possess underappreciated sensitivity to thermal gradients, while others suggest that chance played a larger role than recorded accounts imply. You continue forward again, adjusting slightly based on sensation rather than sight. The snow beneath you feels marginally denser now, or perhaps just more compacted by repeated movement through the same general space. It is difficult to tell. The wind changes again, not in strength but in structure. It no longer flows evenly across your body. Instead, it arrives in irregular pulses, as if the air itself is reorganizing its internal layers. Records confirm that severe frontier whiteouts often involved turbulent wind stratification where ground-level currents behave differently from higher atmospheric movement, creating confusing feedback for travelers attempting to use wind as directional reference. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that experienced individuals learn to distinguish between surface wind and lift wind, using differences in pressure and sound texture as navigational cues. Historians still argue whether this represents genuine skill acquisition or selective memory of successful outcomes. You pause again briefly. The environment does not change during your pause, but your perception of it stabilizes slightly. Stillness becomes a form of recalibration. Snow continues uniformly. No landmarks emerge. No breaks appear in the white field surrounding you. One curious footnote describes settlers in whiteouts sometimes misjudging the duration of pauses, believing they had stood still for minutes when only seconds had passed, or vice versa, due to lack of external temporal reference points. While this is difficult to verify precisely, it aligns with known effects of sensory monotony on time perception. You begin moving again slower now, almost cautiously synchronized with breath rather than intention. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival in extreme whiteouts depended on deliberate technique or whether most successful outcomes resulted from proximity to shelter combined with persistence through disorientation. There is no unified conclusion, only layered interpretations drawn from fragmented and often contradictory records. The wind softens slightly for a moment, then returns in a different direction. You adjust, without fully knowing why, trusting sensation more than certainty. And in that adjustment, something changes not in the storm, but in your relationship to it. You are no longer trying to escape it. You are simply continuing within it. The whiteout does not loosen its grip, but something subtle begins to shift in how it feels against you. It is still dense, still all-consuming, yet you start to notice that not every part of it is identical. There are variations now, small inconsistencies in pressure and sound absorption, in how the wind behaves when it meets your body. You move carefully, continuing the rhythm that has become your only reliable structure. Step, breath, pause, step again. The pattern does not guide you to safety, but it prevents collapse into disorientation. Records confirm that frontier travelers in extreme blizzards often reported gradual sensory recalibration after prolonged exposure, where initial confusion slowly gave way to heightened awareness of microsignals in wind-snow density and temperature gradients. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals becoming more confident navigating within whiteouts after extended time inside them. Though this may reflect survival bias, as those who failed are less likely to have left detailed records. Historians still argue whether this represents genuine adaptation or selective documentation of successful endurance. You notice now that the wind is not uniform. It has layers. Some pass low across the ground, others brush higher, and occasionally a faint vertical shift crosses your perception like a moving boundary. You cannot see it, but you can feel it reorganizing the space around you. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers learning to identify directional stability by turning their faces slightly into the wind and noting subtle differences in pressure between each side of the jaw or cheekbone. While difficult to quantify, this method appears frequently enough across independent accounts to suggest shared experiential discovery rather than isolated coincidence. Scholars bicker over whether such sensory techniques were deliberately developed or gradually emerged through repeated exposure to identical environmental stressors across multiple frontier regions. Some argue for unconscious pattern recognition, while others emphasize cultural transmission of survival knowledge through informal teaching. You continue forward. The snow beneath you is still consistent in appearance, but not in behavior. In some areas it compresses more firmly, in others it yields slightly. These differences are small, but they begin to form a kind of invisible map under your feet. The world remains visually empty, but it is no longer entirely featureless in sensation. You pause briefly. The stillness does not bring clarity, but it allows you to recalibrate your awareness of directionless movement. In this silence, your body becomes the primary reference system. Breath remains steady. That is still the most reliable constant. Records confirm that frontier survival during whiteouts often depended on maintaining internal rhythm rather than external orientation, with travelers using breathing counting steps or heartbeat awareness as anchors against sensory disintegration. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals who maintained steady internal rhythm were less likely to panic during prolonged disorientation events. Historians still argue whether this reflects psychological resilience or simply selective reporting of successful cases. You resume walking again, adjusting slightly toward the faintest sense of wind resistance that brushes across your right side. It is not certainty. It is approximation. The storm continues, but it is no longer entirely homogeneous. There are variations in density, small shifts in how the air behaves when it meets obstacles, your body, uneven terrain, perhaps distant trees hidden beyond visibility. One curious footnote describes settlers interpreting changes in snow sound absorption as indicators of terrain proximity, noting that quieter snow often suggested deeper accumulation or softer ground beneath. While partially supported by physical principles, frontier interpretations often extended these observations into broader navigational assumptions. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout navigation was primarily a skill of interpretation or a process of continuous trial and correction where movement itself provided feedback loops for environmental understanding. There is no consensus, only fragmented interpretations of survival behavior under extreme conditions. You feel a slight shift again. The wind lessens for a moment, then returns from a slightly different angle. You adjust your stance without fully committing to the change testing, rather than assuming. The snow remains unbroken. The sky remains absent, yet the environment is no longer entirely indistinguishable. Something is forming in the pattern, even if it cannot yet be named, and you continue through it, step by careful step, as the whiteout slowly becomes less absolute in its uniformity. You begin to notice something that would have been impossible to detect at the start of this storm. The whiteout is still overwhelming, still absolute in its refusal to reveal shape or distance, but it is no longer perfectly uniform. It has texture now, subtle irregularities in how it presses against your senses. You continue moving slowly and deliberately. The rhythm has become almost instinctive at this point, as if your body has taken over the responsibility of decision-making from your mind. Step, breath, pause, adjust, repeat. Records confirm that frontier travelers often described whiteout conditions as living weather, not in a literal sense, but in the way it seemed to respond dynamically to movement and terrain. Oddly enough, some accounts mention that storms appeared to thin temporarily around obstacles such as tree lines or ridges, creating brief zones of reduced intensity that could aid navigation. Historians still argue whether these perceived patterns were real atmospheric effects or cognitive interpretation of random variation. You feel one of those subtle variations now. The wind briefly shifts not away from you, but around you, as if encountering resistance ahead. It is not enough to see anything, but enough to feel spatial difference returning in fragments. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers relying on changes in snow sound texture to detect proximity to structures or terrain features, noting that snow falling near open areas often produced a slightly different acoustic dampening than snow falling near dense obstructions, while difficult to verify precisely. This observation appears repeatedly in independent survival accounts. Scholars bicker over whether such sensory interpretations represent genuine environmental awareness or retrospective pattern recognition imposed on chaotic conditions. Some argue that the human brain, deprived of visual input, becomes hypersensitive to microvariations in sound and pressure. Others suggest that survival narratives tend to overemphasize coherence in hindsight. You continue forward. The snow beneath your feet now feels uneven in a more complex way, not random but layered. Some steps compress easily, others resist slightly more, as if the ground beneath is no longer uniform. Your awareness expands outward again, not visually, but tactically. The wind is no longer just a single force. It arrives in segments, some low and steady, others higher and intermittent. This variation becomes your only map. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often learned to interpret wind segmentation as a form of directional guidance during whiteouts, using changes in pressure across different body points to infer open versus obstructed space. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals could distinguish between open wind and blocked wind based on how it moved around their clothing and exposed skin. Historians still argue whether this reflects true environmental discrimination or refined psychological adaptation. You pause again. Stillness remains neutral. It neither helps nor harms, but it resets perception slightly. Breath continues as the most reliable anchor. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle is a confirmation that you are still within yourself, even if everything outside remains uncertain. The whiteout continues, but its uniformity is weakening. Subtle gradients emerge in perception, areas of slightly denser resistance, slightly quieter zones, slight variations in wind behavior. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting moments where whiteout conditions briefly parted in small irregular patches, revealing partial silhouettes of terrain before closing again. While likely caused by shifting wind and snowfall density, these fleeting visual breaks were often described with emotional intensity in personal accounts. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout navigation depended on environmental intermittency or whether successful movement was simply the result of persistent forward motion until conditions naturally changed. There is no definitive resolution, only overlapping interpretations. You begin moving again. The rhythm remains steady, but now it carries subtle adjustments based on environmental feedback rather than pure repetition. Something is different ahead. Not visible, not yet defined, but perceptible in structure. The wind behaves differently there. The snow responds differently there. The storm is still present, still enveloping, still without clear boundary. But it is no longer completely featureless. And that small difference begins to matter more than anything else. You notice it before you can explain it. The whiteout is still there, still pressing in from every direction, but the way it presses has changed again. It no longer feels like a single continuous wall of weather. It feels more like overlapping layers that occasionally fail to align perfectly. You continue forward, carefully testing each step, as if the ground itself might now carry subtle inconsistencies. The snow still hides everything beneath it, but your perception of that hiding has sharpened. You are no longer only inside the storm. You are interpreting it. Records confirm that frontier survivors often described a stage in prolonged whiteouts where disorientation began to give way to heightened environmental sensitivity, allowing travelers to distinguish minor variations in wind direction, snow density, and even atmospheric pressure changes. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals began to feel openings in storms that were not visible, but sensed through shifts in resistance and sound dampening. Historians still argue whether these perceived openings were actual meteorological thinning zones or cognitive adaptations formed under sustained sensory deprivation. You feel one of those variations now, a slight easing in resistance ahead, not enough to reveal anything, but enough to suggest that space is not equally compressed in all directions. One curious footnote from Frontier Diaries describes travelers interpreting differences in how snow muffled sound as indicators of nearby terrain, noting that softer acoustic absorption sometimes suggested deeper drifts or uneven ground beneath. While not consistently reliable, these interpretations were often used in combination with other sensory cues to guide movement. Scholars bicker over whether frontier navigation in whiteouts was fundamentally multi-sensory integration or whether it was largely probabilistic movement corrected by occasional environmental feedback. Some argue that survival depended on layered perception, while others suggest that chance alignment with favorable terrain played a larger role than acknowledged. You shift your weight slightly and continue. The wind now feels less uniform across your body. One side experiences slightly more resistance than the other. It is subtle but noticeable. You adjust without fully committing, as if testing the environment rather than trusting it. The snow beneath your feet begins to vary again. Not in depth you can see, but in how it reacts. Some steps feel slightly more compact, others slightly softer, as if different layers of accumulation are stacked unevenly beneath the surface. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often use these subtle tactile differences to infer terrain changes, such as frozen ridges, shallow depressions, or wind-swept clearings beneath snow cover. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals becoming so attuned to these variations that they could identify shifts in elevation without visual confirmation. Historians still argue whether this represents genuine somatic adaptation or post-event reconstruction of successful journeys. You pause briefly. The stillness does not erase uncertainty, but it allows you to re-evaluate sensation without motion interference. Breath remains steady. That is still the anchor. Everything else shifts, but breath continues its own rhythm. The whiteout continues, but it is no longer perfectly homogeneous. It contains gradients, now small fluctuations in density and pressure that suggest structure beneath apparent uniformity. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting that storms sometimes seem to breathe with periods of slight easing, followed by renewed intensity, creating cycles that could be loosely tracked for movement planning. While likely reflecting natural wind oscillation patterns, these observations were often recorded in personal journals with interpretive language. You begin moving again, carefully. The direction is still uncertain, but sensation is more informative than it was earlier. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout survival depended on recognizing environmental cycles, or whether individuals simply experienced random intervals of reduced intensity that were later interpreted as meaningful patterns. There is no consensus, only competing interpretations of fragmented observational records. You feel another subtle shift ahead. The wind is less chaotic there, more structured, almost directional, though not stable enough to define. The snow continues without visible boundary, but your awareness of it has changed. It is no longer a single field. It is a layered system. And within that system you continue forward, step by step, as the storm slowly reveals that even emptiness has structure. You begin to understand something unsettling about the storm now. It is not becoming weaker. It is becoming legible. The whiteout still dominates everything around you, but it no longer behaves like absolute uniformity. It behaves like a system with inconsistencies you can begin to feel, even if you cannot see them. You continue walking slower than before, each step more deliberate than the last. The snow beneath your boots compresses differently, in small intervals, sometimes firm, sometimes soft, sometimes uncertain. These variations are not large enough to guide you clearly, but they are enough to prevent total disorientation. Records confirm that frontier travelers, enduring prolonged whiteouts, often began to report a transition phase where sensory deprivation gave way to heightened micro-perception, allowing them to detect differences in wind density, temperature layering, and snow resistance underfoot. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals experiencing what they called directional intuition, a sense of where open space might exist, based solely on environmental resistance. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine adaptive sensory refinement or cognitive reconstruction after successful navigation events. You pause briefly. The white around you remains unbroken, but it is no longer identical in all directions. There are faint gradients now, slight differences in how the wind presses against your left and right sides, subtle enough that you might have missed them earlier, but now unmistakable in their inconsistency. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers using layered environmental cues, simultaneously combining wind pressure, snow texture, and auditory dampening to construct mental maps of movement even when visual reference was entirely absent. While difficult to verify experimentally, this multisensory approach appears repeatedly across independent survival narratives. Scholars bicker over whether whiteout navigation was primarily an instinctive recalibration of perception or a learned survival technique refined through repeated exposure to identical environmental stressors. Some argue that human perception becomes more flexible under deprivation, while others suggest that only those with prior experience survived long enough to report such adaptations. You begin moving again. The wind ahead feels slightly different now, not stronger or weaker, but more structured. It does not arrive as a single force, but as overlapping streams that intersect briefly before dispersing. The snow beneath you continues to vary subtly in response. Some areas compress more densely, others give slightly, as if the ground is uneven in ways you cannot yet see. This inconsistency becomes your only guide. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often learned to interpret these micro-variations as indicators of terrain shifts such as ridges, dips, or wind-carved openings beneath snow cover. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals developed near instantaneous recognition of these patterns after prolonged exposure, allowing them to adjust direction without conscious deliberation. Historians still argue whether this represents true sensory adaptation or rapid unconscious pattern matching. You slow again briefly still. The storm does not respond to your pause, but your perception stabilizes slightly. Stillness here is not safety, but clarity. Breath continues as the most reliable constant. Each inhale and exhale remains unaffected by external chaos, anchoring you in something internal, while everything external remains unstalled. The whiteout persists, but its structure is increasingly apparent. It is not empty. It is stratified, layers of wind, snow, and pressure moving at slightly different speeds. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting moments when storms seemed to shift thickness, as if parts of the air became denser or lighter in localized regions. While likely attributable to wind variability and snow distribution, these descriptions were often recorded with striking emotional emphasis in personal accounts. You continue forward again, carefully. The environment no longer feels entirely random. It feels variable in patterned ways you are beginning to recognize, but not yet fully understand. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival in whiteouts depended on recognizing environmental stratification or whether perceived structure was simply imposed by the mind, attempting to restore order to chaotic sensory input. There is no resolution, only layered interpretations of incomplete evidence. The wind ahead softens briefly, then shifts again, not violently but distinctly. That change carries information now, not clarity, but suggestion. You move toward it, and in doing so, you realize that even within the storm structure has always been there. You are only just learning how to feel it. You begin to notice that the storm no longer feels like a single overwhelming force. It feels more like a shifting architecture of air and snow, constantly rebuilding itself in slow, invisible layers. Nothing has truly cleared yet. Nothing remains perfectly uniform either. You continue walking carefully, aligning each step with the subtle feedback the ground gives you. The snow still hides everything beneath it, but it now communicates in faint variations of resistance. It is as if the terrain's beginning to speak in a language made only of pressure and texture. Records confirm that frontier travelers often described advanced stages of whiteout navigation as a form of reading the storm, where survival depended on interpreting gradients in wind-sound absorption and snow density rather than visual landmarks. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals could eventually distinguish directional corridors within storms, areas of slightly reduced resistance that allowed safer movement through otherwise uniform conditions. Historians still argue whether these corridors were real meteorological structures or perceptual constructs formed by heightened sensory adaptation. You pause briefly. The wind is no longer identical across all directions. On your right side, it feels marginally lighter. On your left, slightly denser, as if something unseen is shaping airflow unevenly. One curious footnote from Frontier Journals describes travelers using the direction of snow impact on exposed skin to infer orientation, noting that consistent lateral pressure could indicate relative alignment with wind flow patterns. While not precise, this method appears frequently in survival narratives as a supplementary navigation aid. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout survival relied on systematic environmental decoding or whether it was largely a process of incremental correction guided by chance alignment and persistence. Some argue that structured interpretation developed over time through repeated exposure, while others suggest that successful navigation events were disproportionately recorded, skewing historical understanding. You begin moving again. The storm ahead still obscures everything, but it now behaves with subtle variability. Snow density fluctuates in small waves, sometimes thinning just enough to suggest depth beneath uniformity. Your awareness expands outward again, not visually, but tactically. The ground is no longer simply flat resistance. It is uneven in ways that can be felt through careful movement. Slight dips, firmer ridges, compressed patches that suggest prior wind activity. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often relied on these tactile cues to infer hidden terrain, features such as frozen riverbeds, wind-carved drifts, or partially buried obstacles. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals developing almost immediate correction responses when encountering these variations, adjusting their path without conscious analysis. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine embodied cognition or learned environmental familiarity. You slow again. Stillness returns not as safety, but as recalibration. The storm does not pause for you, but your perception stabilizes slightly when motion ceases. Breath remains constant. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle feels more distinct now, less absorbed by the surrounding white. The wind shifts again, but more clearly this time. It is not random. It carries a slight directional consistency, repeating in subtle intervals that suggest broader atmospheric flow rather than chaotic turbulence. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting moments where storms seemed to form channels, temporary alignments of reduced resistance that allowed brief periods of easier movement before closing again. While likely caused by shifting wind patterns interacting with terrain, these observations were often interpreted with striking narrative detail in personal accounts. You begin moving again, following sensation rather than certainty. The storm still surrounds you completely, but it no longer feels entirely without structure. Scholars bicker over whether frontier navigation in whiteouts was primarily interpretive skill, or whether environmental variability naturally created exploitable pathways that experienced travelers learned to detect. There is no consensus, only overlapping theories derived from fragmented observational records. The snow continues uninterrupted, but now it carries subtle rhythm, variations in density, shifts in pressure, slight changes in wind layering. And within that rhythm, you continue forward, realizing that even the most complete whiteout is not absence. It is structure you are only beginning to read. You notice almost unexpectedly that the storm is no longer completely indistinguishable in all directions. It still surrounds you without mercy, but now it behaves like something with internal variation, as if different parts of it are moving with slightly different intentions. You continue forward slower now, relying less on momentum and more on accumulated sensation. The snow beneath your feet still hides the world entirely, but it communicates in texture shifts that are becoming easier to recognize. Some steps compress deeply, others resist sooner, as though the ground is subtly rearranging itself beneath the storm. Records confirm that frontier travelers who survived extended whiteout exposure often described a gradual transition from confusion to heightened environmental discrimination, where wind pressure, snow density, and even microtemperature changes became meaningful navigational indicators. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals began to perceive paths of least resistance within storms, not visible, but physically felt through variations in movement effort. Historians still argue whether these pathways were actual meteorological formations or perceptual constructions shaped by adaptive sensory processing. You pause again. The wind now carries a more consistent directional bias across your left side. It is not strong enough to define orientation, but stable enough to be noticed over time. This consistency becomes a reference point. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers using the angle of snow impact on clothing as a crude directional guide, noting that persistent asymmetry in wind contact could suggest relative alignment to storm flow. While not precise, it was often combined with other cues to form composite navigation judgments. Scholars bicker over whether whiteout survival was primarily a process of multisensory integration, or whether it relied on probabilistic movement guided by intermittent environmental feedback. Some argue that the human nervous system adapts rapidly to sensory deprivation by amplifying subtle inputs, while others suggest that recorded successes are disproportionately represented compared to failures. You begin moving again. The storm remains visually unchanged, but now it feels stratified. The wind is no longer uniform. It arrives in overlapping layers, some near the ground, others slightly higher, each moving at subtly different speeds. The snow beneath you continues to vary, not in obvious ways, but in resistance patterns that suggest hidden terrain shifts. Slight firmness changes indicate compressed layers, possibly wind-packed snow or underlying uneven ground. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often use these tactile variations to infer safe passage routes through otherwise featureless terrain, especially when navigating areas with buried obstacles or uneven drifts. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals adjusting direction almost unconsciously in response to these cues, suggesting a form of embodied environmental awareness. Historians still argue whether this reflects learned skill or adaptive neural response to repetitive exposure. You slow again. The whiteout does not change when you stop, but your awareness of its structure becomes more refined. Breath remains your most stable reference. Each inhale and exhale continues with predictable rhythm, unaffected by external instability. It becomes the anchor around which everything else fluctuates. The wind ahead briefly softens, then returns with a slightly altered direction. The change is not dramatic, but it is distinct enough to register as meaningful. The storm is no longer directionless. It has gradients. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting intermittent channels of reduced wind resistance during severe storms, allowing brief periods of easier movement through otherwise dense conditions. While likely resulting from terrain interaction and atmospheric flow dynamics, these accounts were often recorded in highly interpretive language. You continue forward again, aligning movement with sensation rather than certainty. The storm still obscures everything, but it no longer feels entirely uniform or absolute. Scholars bicker over whether frontier navigation in whiteouts depended on structured environmental reading, or whether successful movement emerged from cumulative adjustments made through trial and sensory feedback. There is no final consensus, only competing frameworks built from partial historical evidence. The snow continues without visual change, but its internal behavior is no longer identical. It shifts in density. It bends wind differently. It carries subtle inconsistencies that now serve as information. And within those inconsistencies, you continue forward, realizing that even the most complete storm is never truly without pattern. You begin to sense something quietly transformative happening inside the storm, though it is not the storm itself that changes, but your ability to exist within it without losing reference. The whiteout is still total, still overwhelming in its visual absence, but it no longer feels entirely indifferent. You continue moving each step now, guided less by uncertainty and more by accumulated sensation. The snow beneath your feet varies in subtle ways, sometimes compacted, sometimes yielding, sometimes layered in ways that suggest unseen contours beneath the surface. Records confirm that frontier travelers who endured prolonged whiteouts often reported a phase where environmental ambiguity began to resolve into layered perception, allowing them to distinguish differences in wind resistance, thermal variation, and snow density with increasing confidence. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals developing what they called storm familiarity, a sense of recognizing patterns within conditions that initially seemed entirely uniform. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine perceptual adaptation or the brain's tendency to impose structure on persistent sensory input. You pause briefly. The wind is now more directional than before. It is not stable enough to define orientation, but consistent enough to suggest a dominant flow. That consistency becomes a reference point you can return to mentally. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers using layered wind perception, noting differences between ground-level pressure and higher air movement to estimate direction during full whiteouts. While difficult to verify in controlled conditions, this method appears repeatedly in independent survival narratives across multiple regions. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout navigation was primarily a learned sensory skill or whether survival outcomes were largely determined by environmental variability intersecting with persistence and chance. Some argue that repeated exposure trained the nervous system to detect micro-patterns in chaotic input, while others suggest that recorded accounts overrepresent successful adaptations. You begin walking again. The storm remains visually unchanged, but its internal structure is now more perceptible. Wind flows in overlapping layers, some moving close to the ground, others higher, creating subtle interference patterns that can be felt rather than seen. The snow beneath you continues to shift in texture. Certain areas compress more deeply, suggesting hidden density variations below the surface. These differences become increasingly meaningful as reference points for movement. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often relied on these tactile and auditory cues, simultaneously forming composite environmental models to navigate areas where visibility was entirely absent. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals could eventually identify stable directional corridors within storms where movement required less resistance due to wind alignment. Historians still argue whether these corridors were real atmospheric structures shaped by terrain or perceptual constructs developed through adaptation. You slow again. Stillness does not stop the storm, but it refines perception. Without movement, subtle differences in wind and pressure become easier to detect. Breath remains steady. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle continues as the most reliable constant in an otherwise shifting environment. The wind shifts again slightly lower and more structured. It no longer feels entirely random. There is repetition in its variation, as if the storm is cycling through patterns rather than behaving chaotically. One curious footnote describes settlers noting temporary soft zones within blizzards areas where wind intensity briefly diminished, allowing easier travel before conditions returned to full severity. While likely caused by atmospheric turbulence interacting with terrain, these observations were often recorded in highly interpretive, almost narrative language. You begin moving again, carefully. The storm remains absolute in appearance, but not in behavior. It is beginning to reveal gradients of resistance and flow. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival in whiteouts depended on precise environmental interpretation, or whether most successful navigation resulted from incremental corrections made over time through persistent movement and sensory feedback. There is no unified conclusion, only overlapping theories constructed from fragmented historical records. The snow continues without visible structure, yet its internal behavior now carries information you can interpret in motion, variations in density, shifts in pressure, subtle directional biases. And within that evolving awareness, you continue forward, realizing that even the most complete storm is never truly without form. It only waits to be understood. You notice something subtle again, though. It does not announce itself clearly. The storm is still fully present, still absolute in its white silence, but it no longer feels entirely uniform in its pressure against you. It feels structured now, like overlapping currents that occasionally fail to align perfectly. You continue moving forward carefully, matching each step to the growing sensitivity you've developed to the ground beneath the snow. The surface is no longer just a blank resistance. It carries variations small and irregular, as though terrain beneath the white layer is beginning to assert itself in faint echoes. Records confirm that frontier travelers, enduring prolonged blizzards, often described a late-stage adaptation in which the environment ceased to feel chaotic and instead became interpretable through layered sensory inputs, particularly wind pressure, thermal shifts, and footfall resistance. Oddly enough, some accounts mention that individuals began to recognize safe directions, not visually, but through the sensation of reduced effort required to move through certain paths. Historians still argue whether this represents true environmental structuring or perceptual bias formed through continuous exposure. You pause briefly. The wind is no longer entirely directionless. It carries a subtle consistency from one side of your body, not strong enough to orient you fully, but stable enough to register as a pattern rather than randomness. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers using uneven snow compression beneath their boots as a form of terrain mapping, noting that areas with slightly firmer resistance often indicated wind-packed drifts or shallow underlying slopes. While not precise, this technique appears frequently in survival narratives as part of combined sensory navigation. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout navigation depended more on learned environmental reading, or whether survival outcomes were largely the result of intermittent clarity windows within storms that allowed partial reorientation. Some argue that human perception becomes increasingly adaptive under deprivation, while others suggest that recorded accounts exaggerate coherence after the fact. You begin walking again. The storm remains visually unchanged, but its internal structure feels more complex. Wind no longer moves as a single mass. It arrives in layered streams, some closer to the ground, others higher, occasionally intersecting in ways that subtly alter pressure against your body. The snow beneath you continues to vary in texture. Some areas compress with greater firmness, others yield more easily, suggesting differences in accumulation or underlying terrain features hidden beneath the surface. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often develop the ability to interpret such micro-variations as indicators of safe passage, particularly in regions where drifts concealed uneven ground or hidden obstacles. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that over time individuals could instinctively adjust their direction based on these variations without conscious analysis. Historians still argue whether this reflects true embodied adaptation or retrospective narrative coherence. You slow again. Stillness does not reduce the storm, but it refines your perception of it. Without movement, subtle differences in wind flow become easier to detect. Breath remains the most stable reference point. Each inhale and exhale continues in steady rhythm, unaffected by external instability. It anchors you in something internal while everything external remains variable. The wind ahead shifts once more slightly smoother in flow. It does not fully align, but it shows consistency in direction over a longer interval than before. That consistency becomes meaningful. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting temporary corridors of ease during severe storms, where wind resistance decreased slightly, allowing more efficient movement before conditions returned to full intensity. While likely caused by terrain channeling wind patterns, these observations were often described with striking narrative clarity in personal accounts. You continue forward again, adjusting your movement based on sensation rather than certainty. The storm still obscures everything visually, but it no longer behaves as a single, undifferentiated force. Scholars bicker over whether frontier navigation in whiteouts was primarily a process of interpreting environmental structure, or whether it depended on continuous corrective movement through unpredictable terrain until accidental alignment occurred. There is no consensus, only fragmented interpretations drawn from incomplete historical documentation. The snow continues uninterrupted, but its internal behavior is no longer identical. It varies, it shifts, it carries subtle gradients of resistance and flow. And within those gradients, you continue forward, realizing that even the most complete storm is never truly without direction. It simply requires a different kind of reading. You begin to sense that the storm is no longer something you are merely inside, but something you are actively interpreting with increasing precision. It has not changed its nature, but your awareness of its internal inconsistencies has deepened enough that it no longer feels entirely formless. You continue moving forward slower now, each step shaped by accumulated understanding of snow resistance beneath your boots. The ground is still hidden, still entirely erased from sight, but it now communicates through subtle variation in compression and texture. Records confirm that frontier travelers who survived prolonged whiteout exposure often entered a stage where navigation became dependent on layered environmental reading, combining wind direction, snow density, and thermal microshifts into a continuous interpretive system. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals forming what they called mental corridors, imagined pathways based on perceived reductions in resistance through storm layers. Historians still argue whether these corridors were real environmental formations or cognitive structures imposed to maintain directional coherence. You pause briefly. The wind is more stable now, in one direction not fully aligned, but consistent enough to register as a dominant flow. It brushes across your body with a repeated rhythm, suggesting a larger atmospheric movement pattern beneath the surface turbulence. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers using the sound of snow underfoot as a directional indicator, noting that quieter compression often suggested deeper accumulation zones or wind-sheltered areas. While not reliable in isolation, it was frequently used alongside wind and tactile cues as part of composite navigation strategies. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout navigation relied on true environmental decoding or whether it was primarily a form of probabilistic movement corrected through intermittent feedback. Some argue that human perception becomes increasingly pattern-seeking under sensory deprivation, while others suggest that survival records indicate genuine adaptive enhancement of environmental sensitivity. You begin walking again. The storm remains visually unchanged, but its internal structure now feels more segmented. Wind moves in overlapping streams, some steady, others fragmented, occasionally intersecting in ways that alter pressure against your clothing and skin. The snow beneath you continues to vary subtly. Certain areas compress with slightly greater firmness, while others give more readily, suggesting hidden irregularities beneath the surface. These differences are no longer random to you. They form a kind of emergent structure. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often used such tactile variations to infer safe travel routes through otherwise featureless terrain, especially in areas where drifts concealed obstacles or uneven ground. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals could eventually navigate without conscious deliberation, relying on embodied environmental familiarity. Historians still debate whether this reflects genuine physiological adaptation or narrative reconstruction of successful journeys. You slow again. Stillness sharpens perception. The storm does not change, but your awareness of its layered behavior becomes more refined when movement ceases. Breath remains your constant anchor. Each inhale and exhale continues in predictable rhythm, unaffected by external variability. It becomes the only stable structure within an otherwise shifting environment. The wind ahead shows slightly increased consistency, not clarity but coherence. It suggests a directional bias that persists longer than before, offering a subtle reference point for movement. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting brief eased channels within storms where wind resistance diminished temporarily, allowing more efficient travel before returning to full intensity. While likely caused by atmospheric flow interaction with terrain features, these observations were often recorded in highly interpretive language within personal accounts. You continue forward again, adjusting step by step according to sensory feedback rather than certainty. The storm remains fully present, but it is no longer entirely undifferentiated. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival in whiteouts depended on structured environmental interpretation or whether successful navigation emerged from continuous micro-adjustments made under unpredictable conditions. There is no consensus, only fragmented theoretical models built from incomplete historical evidence. The snow continues without visible structure, but its behavior is now increasingly legible in motion. Variations in density, subtle wind layering, gradual shifts in resistance, and within that evolving structure, you continue forward understanding that even the most complete storm is never truly without form. It simply reveals itself in fragments. You notice it again, that subtle shift in how the storm behaves around you, as if it is no longer a single uninterrupted force, but a layered system of movement and resistance. The whiteout is still complete in appearance, still denying all visual structure, yet it now carries variations that you can feel more clearly than before. You continue forward carefully, placing each step with growing attention to the feedback beneath your feet. The snow is no longer just a blank surface. It responds differently in small, almost imperceptible ways, sometimes firmer, sometimes softer, sometimes shifting under pressure in a way that suggests hidden contours below. Records confirm that frontier travelers in prolonged winter conditions often relied on cumulative sensory interpretation to maintain orientation, combining ground resistance, wind flow patterns, and thermal differences into a single continuous awareness model. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals becoming more confident the longer they remained within whiteouts, as if familiarity with uncertainty itself became a form of navigation. Historians still argue whether this reflects true adaptation or selective memory from those who survived long enough to record their experiences. You pause, briefly. The wind is no longer entirely chaotic. It carries a subtle directional tendency consistent enough to notice over time, though not strong enough to define a clear heading. It brushes against you in a repeated rhythm that suggests broader atmospheric structure beneath the storm's surface turbulence. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers using variations in snow impact sound as a supplementary navigation aid, noting that areas with denser accumulation often dampened sound more completely than exposed or windswept regions. While not precise, this method was frequently combined with wind and tactile cues in survival situations. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout navigation was primarily a process of environmental decoding or whether it relied on adaptive sensory recalibration under prolonged deprivation. Some argue that the human nervous system becomes increasingly sensitive to micro variations in pressure and temperature when deprived of visual input, while others suggest that recorded accounts exaggerate coherence in retrospective interpretation. You begin moving again. The storm remains visually unchanged, but its internal structure feels more complex. Wind no longer behaves as a single continuous flow. It arrives in layered streams that occasionally intersect, creating brief fluctuations in pressure against your body. The snow beneath you continues to vary in texture. Some areas compress more firmly, suggesting underlying density, while others yield slightly more, indicating uneven accumulation or wind-shifted layering beneath the surface. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often interpreted such variations as indicators of hidden terrain features, including drift formations, frozen irregularities, or subtle elevation changes. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals could eventually navigate without conscious deliberation, relying instead on accumulated bodily familiarity with environmental resistance patterns. Historians still debate whether this reflects genuine somatic adaptation or narrative reinforcement after survival success. You slow again. Stillness does not alter the storm, but it refines your perception of its layered behavior. Without movement, the subtle differences in wind flow and pressure become more distinguishable. Breath remains the most stable reference point. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle continues with unwavering regularity, providing internal structure against external variability. The wind ahead shows a slightly more stable pattern now, not fully coherent, but persistent enough to suggest directional bias over time. It becomes a reference point that you adjust toward cautiously. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting temporary soft corridors within severe storms, where wind resistance decreased noticeably for short intervals before returning to full intensity. While likely caused by atmospheric interaction with terrain, these observations were often recorded in highly interpretive language that emphasized their perceived significance. You continue forward again, carefully adjusting movement based on sensation rather than certainty. The storm still surrounds you completely, but it is no longer entirely undifferentiated. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival in whiteouts depended on structured environmental interpretation or whether successful navigation emerged through continuous micro-corrections made under unpredictable sensory conditions. There is no consensus, only fragmented models derived from incomplete historical documentation. The snow continues uninterrupted, but its internal behavior is now increasingly legible. Variations in density, shifts in wind layering, subtle directional gradients, and within that emerging structure, you continue forward, realizing that even the most complete storm is never truly without pattern. It only requires time to learn how to feel. You begin to understand that the storm is no longer just something surrounding you. It has become something you are reading in real time, like a shifting text written in wind pressure and snow resistance instead of words. The whiteout still denies sight, but it no longer denies meaning. You continue forward carefully, with a rhythm that feels increasingly natural now. Each step is no longer just movement through uncertainty, but a small negotiation with the ground beneath the snow. Some areas resist more firmly, others yield slightly, and these differences begin to form a quiet internal map. Records confirm that frontier travelers who endured extended whiteout conditions often reported a transition into what they described as interpretive movement, where navigation was guided less by conscious direction and more by continuous sensory correction. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals became capable of maintaining relatively straight travel paths within storms by subconsciously adjusting to subtle shifts in wind and terrain resistance. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine adaptive skill or the selective survival of those who managed to maintain directional coherence long enough to document their experience. You pause briefly. The wind is still present, but it no longer feels chaotic. It carries a directional bias that persists over longer intervals, creating a subtle gradient of pressure across your body. It is not a clear path, but it is no longer random. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers using repeated tactile feedback from walking sticks or tools to detect hidden changes in snow density, particularly in regions where drifts concealed uneven ground or frozen obstacles. While simple in concept, this technique appears frequently across survival accounts as part of layered environmental interpretation. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout navigation depended primarily on conscious environmental decoding or whether it emerged from unconscious pattern recognition refined through repeated exposure. Some argue that the human nervous system adapts to sensory deprivation by amplifying micro-variations in input, while others suggest that historical accounts overemphasize coherence in hindsight reconstruction. You begin walking again. The storm remains visually unchanged, but its internal structure is increasingly perceptible. Wind flows in layered streams, some near the ground, others higher, occasionally intersecting, in ways that create brief changes in pressure against your clothing and skin. The snow beneath you continues to vary subtly. Certain areas compress more firmly, indicating denser accumulation, while others yield slightly more, suggesting uneven layering or wind redistribution beneath the surface. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often relied on these tactile differences to infer hidden terrain features such as shallow depressions, frozen ridges, or windswept channels beneath snow cover. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that over time individuals developed an almost automatic response to these variations, adjusting their direction without conscious reasoning. Historians still debate whether this reflects true embodied adaptation or narrative simplification of successful outcomes. You slow again. Stillness sharpens perception. The storm does not change, but your awareness of its layered behavior becomes more refined when movement stops. Breath remains your anchor. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle continues with steady rhythm, unaffected by external instability. It becomes the only consistent structure within an otherwise shifting environment. The wind ahead stabilizes slightly, not fully, but enough to suggest a persistent directional tendency. It is not a path, but a bias, a subtle leaning in the environment that you begin to align with. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting temporary channels of reduced resistance within severe storms, where wind intensity dropped noticeably for short intervals before returning to full force. While likely caused by atmospheric interaction with terrain features, these observations were often recorded with strong interpretive emphasis in personal narratives. You continue forward again, adjusting carefully to the sensation of movement rather than certainty. The storm still surrounds you completely, but it is no longer entirely without structure. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival in whiteouts depended on structured environmental interpretation or whether successful navigation emerged through continuous sensory correction under unpredictable conditions. There is no final consensus, only fragmented theoretical models derived from incomplete historical evidence. The snow continues without visual structure, but its behavior is now increasingly legible. Variations in density, subtle wind layering, gradual directional consistency. And within that emerging pattern, you continue forward realizing that even the most complete storm is never truly without order. It only requires perception long enough to recognize it. You start to notice something quietly decisive about the storm now. It is still vast, still consuming everything in white, but it no longer feels entirely directionless. The patterns you once struggled to detect are now repeating in subtle cycles, as if the environment is offering you fragments of structure just long enough for you to follow them. You continue forward with careful consistency. Each step is measured less by intention and more by response. The snow beneath your feet compresses in ways that are no longer identical from one step to the next. Some areas feel slightly denser, others slightly hollowed, as if wind has been shaping hidden contours beneath the surface all along. Records confirm that frontier travelers who survived prolonged whiteout conditions often described reaching a stage where navigation became reactive rather than planned, with movement guided by continuous adjustment to environmental feedback rather than fixed direction. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals could maintain surprisingly straight trajectories by subconsciously balancing wind pressure and ground resistance over time. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine environmental attunement or retrospective reconstruction of successful passages through unpredictable terrain. You pause briefly. The wind is more stable now in its inconsistency, if that makes sense within this place. It no longer shifts randomly from moment to moment. Instead, it follows a slow rolling pattern suggesting larger atmospheric structures moving across the landscape. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers detecting soft lanes within storms areas where wind pressure decreased slightly and snow behaved with less resistance, allowing safer passage through otherwise dense conditions. While likely caused by interaction between terrain and atmospheric flow, these observations were often recorded with strong narrative emphasis, as if they represented meaningful pathways rather than temporary fluctuations. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout navigation relied on structured interpretation of environmental layering, or whether successful movement was largely the result of persistent trial and correction until accidental alignment occurred. There is no consensus, only fragmented theories drawn from inconsistent historical documentation. You begin walking again. The storm remains visually unchanged, but its internal behavior feels increasingly organized. Wind no longer moves as a single force. It travels in overlapping streams, some near the ground, others higher, occasionally intersecting in ways that subtly alter pressure and temperature around you. The snow beneath you continues to vary. Certain areas compress more firmly, indicating denser accumulation or wind-packed layers beneath, while others yield slightly more, suggesting uneven terrain or shifted drifts. These differences are now meaningful enough to influence direction. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often relied on such tactile variations to infer hidden environmental features, including shallow slopes, frozen ridges, and wind-carved channels beneath snow cover. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals developing near-instantaneous corrective responses to these variations, adjusting direction without conscious deliberation. Historians still debate whether this reflects true embodied environmental adaptation or narrative refinement after survival. You slow again. Stillness brings clarity not of sight but of sensation. The storm does not change, but your perception of its structure becomes more defined when movement pauses. Breath remains constant. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle continues with steady rhythm, forming the only internal reference point within a shifting external system. The wind ahead shows a more consistent directional bias now. It is not a path, but it is no longer random. It suggests movement within structure rather than chaos. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting brief periods of ease corridors during severe storms, where wind resistance dropped noticeably for short intervals before returning to full intensity. While likely caused by atmospheric flow interacting with terrain, these accounts were often recorded in highly interpretive language that emphasized their perceived significance. You continue forward again carefully, aligning movement with sensation rather than certainty. The storm still surrounds you completely, but it is no longer entirely undifferentiated. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival in whiteouts depended on structured environmental decoding or whether successful navigation emerged from continuous micro-adjustments made under unpredictable conditions. There is no final consensus, only fragmented interpretive models built from incomplete historical records. The snow continues without visible structure, but its behavior is now increasingly readable. Variations in density, subtle wind layering, gradual directional tendencies. And within that structure you continue forward, realizing that even the most complete storm is never truly without order. It only requires persistence long enough to recognize its shape. You begin to feel it before you can fully explain it. A subtle easing, not in intensity, but in the way the storm organizes itself around you. The whiteout is still absolute in appearance, still denying every visual reference, but the internal structure you have been learning to sense is now more consistent, more readable. You continue forward carefully, with a rhythm that has become almost instinctive. Step, breath, adjust. The snow beneath your boots responds in increasingly meaningful variations, sometimes firm and wind-packed, sometimes softer and more uneven, suggesting underlying shifts in terrain that are no longer entirely random to your perception. Records confirm that frontier travelers who survived extended whiteout exposure often described a late-stage condition where navigation transitioned from active interpretation to near-automatic environmental alignment, where movement became guided by accumulated sensory familiarity rather than conscious decision-making. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals could maintain steady directional travel for long periods without visual confirmation, relying entirely on tactile and atmospheric feedback loops. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine sensory adaptation or retrospective simplification of successful journeys through chaotic conditions. You pause, briefly. The wind is still present, but its behavior is now more coherent over time. It no longer shifts erratically. Instead, it flows in slow, broad patterns that persist long enough to be tracked across movement. One curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers noticing gradual opening phases in storms where snowfall density reduced slightly and wind resistance softened, allowing brief improvement in visibility or movement efficiency before conditions returned. While likely caused by natural atmospheric fluctuation, these moments were often interpreted with strong emotional significance in personal accounts. Scholars bicker over whether frontier whiteout navigation depended on structured environmental decoding or whether successful passage resulted from continuous sensory correction through trial and adaptation. There is no consensus, only fragmented theories drawn from inconsistent observational records. You begin walking again. The storm remains visually unchanged, but its internal structure feels increasingly stable. Wind flows in layered streams that maintain direction over longer intervals. Snow continues to vary beneath you, but in patterns that are now recognizable rather than random. The ground itself seems more communicative now. Subtle changes in resistance suggest shifts in elevation or density beneath the snowpack, allowing you to adjust movement without needing sight. These variations form a quiet, continuous dialogue between body and environment. Records confirm that experienced frontier travelers often described reaching a state where movement became guided by felt geography, a form of spatial awareness derived entirely from tactile and atmospheric cues. Oddly enough, some accounts suggest that individuals became more confident within storms than outside them, where visual distractions reintroduced uncertainty. Historians still debate whether this reflects true adaptation or narrative exaggeration shaped by survival bias. You slow again. Stillness does not erase the storm, but it refines perception. The whiteout continues without visual structure, but it is no longer entirely uniform in experience. Breath remains your anchor. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle continues with steady rhythm, grounding you within an otherwise shifting environment. The wind ahead carries a more consistent directional flow, now not forming a clear path but suggesting continuity across space. It is enough to align with cautiously enough to trust in small increments. One curious footnote describes settlers reporting that storms sometimes exhibited lanes of ease, where wind resistance temporarily decreased, allowing smoother passage before conditions intensified again. While likely caused by atmospheric interaction with terrain, these observations were often recorded with strong interpretive framing. You continue forward again, carefully adjusting to the evolving structure of sensation. The storm still surrounds you completely, but it is no longer without form. Scholars bicker over whether frontier survival in whiteouts depended on structured environmental interpretation or whether successful navigation emerged through continuous micro-adjustments made under unpredictable conditions. There is no final resolution, only layered interpretations of incomplete evidence. The snow continues without visible boundaries, but its behavior is now increasingly legible. Variations in density, subtle wind layering, gradual directional coherence, and within that emerging structure you continue forward, realizing that even the most complete storm is never truly without order. It only takes time and persistence to recognize it. You realize without any dramatic moment announcing it that the storm is no longer the same kind of unknown you first entered. It has not disappeared, not weakened in any obvious way, but it has become something your mind can now hold without breaking apart. The whiteout still surrounds you completely, yet it no longer feels infinite in the same way. You continue forward, though the movement now feels less like survival through blindness and more like passage through something structured, something that has form, even if it refuses to reveal it visually. The snow beneath your boots continues its quiet conversation with you, shifting in density, resistance, and subtle firmness. Each variation, now part of a language, you have slowly learned to recognize. Records confirm that frontier travelers who endured prolonged whiteout conditions often described a final stage of adaptation where environmental chaos transformed into perceived order, allowing navigation through what initially seemed completely uniform storms. Oddly enough, some accounts describe individuals developing a deep familiarity with invisible geography where wind flow, pressure gradients, and snow texture collectively formed an internal map of movement. Historians still argue whether this reflects true environmental decoding or the human mind's capacity to impose structure on persistent sensory deprivation. You pause one last time. The wind is still present, but it no longer feels unpredictable. It flows in slow, layered currents that suggest continuity rather than randomness. You can feel it moving across your body in consistent patterns, almost like a language repeating itself with variations you now understand how to interpret. One final curious footnote from frontier journals describes travelers emerging from whiteout storms with an almost contradictory sense of clarity, as if the absence of sight had forced a deeper engagement with every other sense. Some wrote that the world felt newly assembled after storms passed, even though nothing had changed except perception. Historians still debate whether this represents genuine sensory sharpening or emotional reinterpretation after survival. Scholars bicker over whether whiteout endurance fundamentally changed human perception in frontier environments, or whether it simply revealed latent sensory capacities that exist under extreme conditions but remain unused in ordinary life. There is no final answer, only accumulated fragments of testimony shaped by those who returned. You begin walking again, but the urgency has changed. It is no longer about escaping disorientation. It is about continuing within understanding step by step through a system that no longer feels entirely hostile but still entirely overwhelming. The snow continues its endless presence, yet now it carries structure. The wind continues its movement, yet now it carries directionality. The world remains hidden, but it is no longer silent in meaning. And as you move through it, you realize something quiet and steady. Even in the most complete winter, nothing is truly without pattern, only without perception. You are still inside the storm, but you are no longer lost within it. Sweet dreams.